How's it going, everybody? If I could get a sound check from the audience, make sure you can hear us because I've had issues with that before, right at the beginning. Is there any glitches? Although Restream has been better to me than StreamYard, so I've been trying this one out. Can everyone hear us? Yeah, it's pretty alarming sometimes when it just comes out of nowhere. All right, so they can hear us. Welcome, Gideon. I'll say L'chaim Friday night.
See, I should have gotten a drink too. I just went with water. So
Yeah, and I got my water just in case. So welcome, everybody. We got Gideon Lazar here. Would you be so kind as to give us maybe like a brief background on yourself and let us know who you are? I'm sure more of the people are here to see you than me for this one, but just in case there's anyone who doesn't know you.
Yeah, so just a little bit about myself. I was raised in a conservative Jewish family, so all your Orthodox Jewish viewers are free to dismiss me as not really being Jewish. And I was raised there, but not that religious. I have some cultural connections to Judaism, really, at a bar mitzvah and stuff, but I didn't really believe it growing up. Then in high school, I was interested in history, came across evidence for the resurrection of Jesus that I found very convincing. So I got interested in learning about Christianity. Ended up going through the Eastern Orthodox Church for a little bit, but then ended up eventually in the Catholic Church, where I've now been for a little over 6 years now. And so, yeah, you can find me on Twitter as well as Substack under my name. And then I have a YouTube channel called The Byzantine Scotist, because I've Byzantine rite canonically. You don't know what that is, don't worry about it. And then I'm interested in Scotism, which is a philosophical and theological school within the Catholic Church. And then as well, what I wanted to come here to talk about tonight is I work with an organization called the St. Basil Institute for the Study of the Theology of Creation. I'm just an institute coordinator. Everything I say here on this stream tonight is my own personal views, does not reflect the views of the institute. Yeah, what we're trying to do essentially is to revive theological discussion in the Catholic Church around the theology of creation. And really, it's a topic that affects every area of theology. And one of the areas we found that it actually influences things a lot is what's called Catholic social teaching. Essentially, the discussion of... Am I getting like a slight echo?
Hold on a second. Let me go here. Is that better for you now?
Testing. I'm still getting it. Is it coming from my computer?
It's probably a double feedback to you, because I just turned on the echo cancellation, but that's like if you don't have headphones on.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, I'll not worry about it. I'll be fine.
Do you want to maybe pop out and come back in and see if that helps?
Yeah, let me try popping out and coming back in.
In the meantime, now you have to just look at me, which is unfortunate for all of you. L'chaim to everyone. Good Shabbos to all my Jewish viewers who are watching on this Friday night. Let's see if he comes back in. Is that better now?
Yeah, let me test again. Okay, now things are much better. There we go.
Okay, yeah.
What was I saying? Yeah, so essentially the... it's still echoing. Sorry, I don't know what's going on here. Let me see. Try my settings. Audio. Echo cancel. I don't know what it is. I'll have to ignore it. Sorry about this. It's feeding back bad here. I don't know what's going on.
Do you have a second mic and then those?
Yeah, but I plugged my headphones directly into my microphone.
Maybe just try using the... Oh, no, it's not going to be as good, though. Because you could try just using the headset, but...
Yeah. Let me try to figure out what's going on here.
I tried plugging the headset into the computer separately and then select that as the audio source.
Yeah, that's what I have here. How does the audio sound on this?
Now it's using your headset as the microphone. So you got to select the mic as the mic and select those as the output.
Okay. Here we go. All right.
Is that better?
Let me testing. It's still going on. I don't know where this issue's coming from here.
It could be. Hold on a second. Try talking now.
Testing. All right, I don't think I hear it anymore now, so I think it's worked now.
And now try it again.
Testing. I don't hear it now. Oh, wait, no, I do. I hear it now. Okay, let's go back to the one you were just at. All right. Yeah, I don't hear it anymore now.
So what's probably happening is my headset is probably getting picked up by my mic while you're talking.
Okay.
And how about now? Is that okay?
Testing. I still hear it a tiny bit, but it's much better than it was before.
So I'm going to turn mine off while you're talking, and that's going to be the solution.
Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. All right, testing. All right, now I don't hear it. Okay. Sorry about that, everyone in the audience, about that. Yeah. So as I was talking about just a minute ago, I'm here to promote in part a conference, but then I also want to talk about what this is about, which is Catholic social teaching. So that's still okay. There we go. I'm sorry, everyone's completely threw my train of thought off. Apologize for this. Yeah, so we're here to talk about essentially Catholic social teaching. So what is Catholic social teaching? It's essentially when God is coming to save us, save mankind, he's not merely coming to save us as individuals, but to save all of society. And so I think a big advantage the Catholic Church has on this whole subject of Catholic social teaching is to look at the question of how we live in society from a very different angle than we often do in the modern world. And I think it actually gives us an important distance from a lot of the debates that are going on in contemporary society. So I want to talk first about this conference that I have coming up that I'm helping to organize. Here, so I'll pull this up on screen. Here we go. Yeah, so I helped organize this conference here on called Christ, the King of Creation, Catholic Social Teaching and the Theology of Creation, where essentially what we're looking at here is how our understanding of God as the creator of the world actually reshapes our understanding of how we ought to live in society. So if you go to the link, which is Ash has put in the description, you can go to register. And as well, I've given Ash the code ASH, so you can register for 50% off as well. And so in the morning, we're going to be having 3 talks. This is from Pater Edmund Waldstein, Dr. Jennifer Bryson, and Dr. Doyen Nguyen. And what they're going to be talking about is the history of Catholic social teaching as it relates to the theology of creation. So Pater Edmund Waldstein, who's really a brilliant theologian, one of the top theologians, I think, living today in many ways. He will be speaking about Pope Leo XIII, who's sort of the founder of Catholic social teaching. He lived right at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Then we have Dr. Jennifer Bryson, who will be speaking about Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII, who were the popes during World War II. And really in many ways reflected upon the crisis in society that was going on leading up to World War II and during World War II. And really, these popes pointed to how our unity that comes about in Christ is higher than the various divisions that we have societally. And so really called people in the years leading up to World War II to reconsider the dignity of all humans, as we saw sort of this descent in countries in Europe that stopped considering the dignity of various groups of people within their societies that, of course, led to things like the Holocaust and World War II and so on that popes were fighting very strongly against, and also helped, of course, many Jews to escape the Holocaust. I know some people think that Pius XII is Hitler's pope, but that's really not the case. You can go pick up his encyclical, Mystici Corporis Christi, and you'll see in 1943, at the height of World War II, he's releasing an encyclical talking about how neo-pagan ideologies have taken over society, and we need to consider the importance of Christ as the head of the church, who calls all mankind into the church as a point of unity, giving all people a dignity that transcends the divisions that we have at the national level. I don't know how anyone reads pious encyclicals and thinks he's Hitler's pope, but I don't think people read the encyclicals. And then we have Dr. Dorian Nguyen. She's very brilliant, but she spent her life as a medical doctor, so she understands all the medical stuff with bioethics, and then went back in her retirement and got a degree from one of the top Catholic colleges, the Angelicum, in moral theology. So really has this very strong understanding in bioethics of the moral of how the medicine actually works and applying to the questions of bioethics. And she's going to be talking about Pope St. John Paul II, who in many ways faced all these questions we have in the modern world about issues of abortion and sexuality and so on, that were dividing people, in which the Catholic Church has very, I think, important answers to give to the crises we face now. Then in the afternoon, we're going to have some great talks looking at various specific topics within Catholic social teaching. So we have Dr. Jared Goff, who will be speaking about the theology of matrimony and the importance that the Catholic Church gives to matrimony, rooted back in the creation of humanity as man and woman. Then we have Father Daniel Dozier, who will be speaking about the theology of work. And as I'm going to get into in a little bit with Catholic social teaching, I think the church has really profound things to say about the dignity of labor that transcends many of the modern debates we're having about capitalism and socialism and so on, and I think has important things to teach us. And then I'll be speaking at the end, sort of looking at how, if you look at these early popes talking about Catholic social teaching, they predicted really every problem that we now face in society. This was all really predicted long ago. And we didn't listen to what the church was trying to teach us. And so as a result, we've now gone into this insanity where we don't even know what men and women are even more. We don't really, our society on every level is falling apart right now, as I'm sure any young people know, however they feel about what the solutions should be. And I think if we look at how the church, using Catholic theology, was able to predict all the problems that we're now facing, if we listen to it, it will lead us back on the path to a good society and to living in right relationship with one another. And so this will be on November 22nd. It's a Saturday, and about a month from now. And again, the link to it is in the description. If you use the code ASH, you can register for 50% off. All right, yeah, so I hope to see you all there. I think this will be a good conference.
If I turn my volume back up, you can hear me okay, right?
Yeah.
And are you still echoing yourself now?
Testing.
Not as bad, right?
Yeah, not as bad, yeah.
I'm turning my headphone volume down and I'm standing further away from it. So that should do the trick.
All right,
I think I'm feedbacking your audio back to you.
Yeah.
Okay, and then important note here. Thank you, Daniel. That Pope saved 100,000 Jews from the Holocaust. Hitler's Pope, right?
Yeah. Now, if you look at his letters and stuff, I mean, he was living right in Mussolini's Italy, which was really, by that point, a puppet of Hitler. And so if he had said anything, right, that was out in public, what would they have done? They would have removed him and replaced him with a new puppet pope who would actually do what they wanted. And so he was a diplomat before he became the pope. And so he knew how to work things behind the scenes in order to actually save lives. But I think what people want nowadays, they don't want you to actually do something that saves lives. They want you to virtue signal about how you're going to do that, you know?
As long as you talk about saving lives, you've done it, right?
Yeah.
So I guess the next lead into what we're actually talking about today. So you mentioned it briefly in the description of the conference, but maybe this is not the right question, but we'll start from here. What is Catholic social teaching?
Yeah, so essentially Catholic social teaching is the body of teaching that's come about. It really goes back ultimately to sacred scripture itself, as I'm going to show, but really took form in the last 200 years as something that we call Catholic social teaching. And really, the Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed the way society is structured, right? Because it used to be most people worked either on farms or as laborers, and so their work was closely tied to where they lived, their family, and so on. That created this very organic society. And of course, there were lots of issues in the past which the church had spoken about, but it presented itself in a fundamentally new way in this post-industrial revolution society. I think sometimes when we hear concerns about this, we immediately think socialism. But the socialists, the reason that they became popular is because they were talking about real issues that face society. And so, unfortunately, the Industrial Revolution happened right around the same time as the French Revolution. And the French Revolution fundamentally broke a generation of the church, because a huge center of Catholic learning at the time was in France. And so in the French Revolution, the French government killed huge numbers of clergy, exiled huge numbers of clergy, and took over basically all the Catholic churches and universities. And they even turned like Notre Dame into a pagan temple for a little while. You can go look this up, of the Cult of Supreme Reason. And so this really destroyed Catholic intellectual life. And so the church was unable to really respond as it should have when the Industrial Revolution was actually arising. It didn't have the intellectual capacity really in the moment to respond. And as well, Napoleon went and invaded the Vatican. So as well, there was a lot of damage to the church itself in Rome. And so when when you come around to this pope named Pope Leo XIII, who was right near the end of the 19th century, very beginning of the 20th century, he began to think about how the church ought to respond. And part of this was an intellectual revival in his encyclical Aeterni Patris, where he caused this great revival and study of St. Thomas Aquinas. But he also thought this needed to be a social change. And he wrote quite a number of encyclicals on this. The most famous of them is called Rerum Novarum, which means of the new things, where he was speaking about the Industrial Revolution. And since Leo XIII, many popes have continued to expand upon and comment upon this. And our current pope, Pope Leo XIV, has taken his name from Leo XIII. And he said it's because of this issue of Catholic social teaching, that because of AI, we're sort of facing the beginnings of a new industrial revolution from AI. And so he wants to think about sort of, unlike before where the church was responding, sort of running behind, trying to catch up with where things were changing in the world. We want to get out in front now and actually help navigate things as they're happening. And so the root of Catholic social teaching on a theological level, though, I think actually goes back to the theology of creation. It's that we are rational beings, right? So God has placed inclinations in lots of things, right? So if I have, this will show up on camera, I have this AirPod case right now, right? If I let go of it and it drops, it has an inclination to move downwards. And this was talked about by ancient philosophers such as Aristotle. And now this is often critiqued nowadays. And so now we know gravity causes it instead. But no, it doesn't actually change anything. Gravity, we now know more about the science of how it falls downwards, but we still have this idea that there's an inclination it has that is the result of gravity. And likewise, living things have even more inclinations, right? So plants have an inclination to grow. You have a lion, it will have an inclination to hunt. And we share in common, we're animals, so we share in common with the other animals inclinations of life. But we also have, in addition to those, we have a rational soul, that we are made in the image of God, which also gives us other inclinations that are not found in other beings. And the two in specific that St. Thomas Aquinas highlights is our inclination to know God and to live in society. So you did an earlier episode with DoorDash Thomist, and he spoke about how sort of one of the best apologetics for the existence of God is that we know that nothing finite here can really satisfy our desire, that we are seeking the good, and no finite good here is lasting. So the only good that can really satisfy us is God. And so we have this natural inclination to know God. And even the atheist doesn't believe in God. He still has this inclination to know a good that is higher than himself, right? To seek something that is above himself. And so this is the inclination to know God. But we also have an inclination to live in society. And that no human has ever lived on his own. There's a famous statement from this on Aristotle, that if any man is able to live completely on his own, he's either a brute, like an unintelligent animal, or he is like a god. Those are the only sorts of things that could live entirely on their own. That's not what it means for to be a human. And we see this in the narrative in Genesis, that God creates man in the image of God and after the likeness to live alongside him. But then he discovers, right? Adam seeks to name all the animals, and none of the animals are able to satisfy him. And so he needs another human to live with. It is not good for the man to be alone. And so God creates Eve to be Adam's helpmate. That it's good for humans to live with other humans and to live in society, because that's the sort of beings we are. It's because we're made in the image of a multi-personal God. And so we live in multi-personal societies. And this is really the root of Catholic social teaching, is that what we seek when we're seeking the good is not merely our own individual good, but to seek what's called the common good. Now, it's important to realize that when we say the common good, I think a lot of people nowadays think this is something like socialist, right? But it's really not. When, like Karl Marx, when he discusses society, his whole system is based on materialism. But this is entirely opposed to our understanding of the common good. And the common good is something that cannot be lost by being shared, right? So when I am speaking about Catholic social teaching now to you, you're gaining some knowledge, and I don't lose anything from doing this. And so this is a common good that we share in, because by sharing in it, it doesn't cause the reduction of some good. And so we're trying to seek a society in which everyone can live a good, dignified life, and ultimately to come to know God. And that's a sort of common good that we're speaking of. We're not speaking of that everyone has enough money that they can go sort of do whatever they want with their money. That's completely the opposite of the sort of society. That would actually be a complete dystopia, where everyone had the material resources to destroy themselves. The purpose of our life is to seek to live a truly virtuous life. And we see this as well in Scripture, that we start off with the society of a family. There's Adam and Eve, but then they have children and they reproduce and create a larger society. And so man then comes together as well and forms political societies. That as humans, we were meant to develop and spread across the face of the earth. And so, well, I think it's sometimes important to have discussions. There are going to be things that are going to face all of humanity. Most things are not dealt with well at sort of this highest level. And so we form political communities that tend to be more local than the whole world, whether these be a single city, as in some societies, or whether they be larger countries. And this is what we call the two necessary communities. There is the family as a necessary society, and the political community is a necessary society. This doesn't mean that the political authority ought to be, say, totalitarian or anything, but there is a real place for political authority. And we see this in Scripture as well, right? That when God gives Moses a law, he gives them a law that's going to govern how they live their lives. There is a large portion of the Torah that is about living their lives, and how they ought to govern their society. And so this is fundamentally what Catholic social teaching is about. It's about how we live in society, in these necessary societies of our family, of our political community. And as well, there's an additional third necessary society, which is the church. And this is because of, well, there's two reasons really we can give for the need for the church. So the first and obvious one is that we are fallen beings. We see this again in Genesis. So while we can, even Greek and Roman philosophers talked about things like man's natural inclination to live in society and so on, they did not know that we were fallen beings. Versus we see in Genesis, that right, God gives man the supernatural life in the beginning, and he forfeits this through his sin. And this not only does this, we lose our relationship with God, but it actually damages our nature as well. So he told me at the beginning, some people are mad when he mentioned Paul, but there's a great discussion of this by St. Paul in Romans 7-8, where he says there's the law of my mind, which is telling me what I ought to do. And this is what St. Thomas Aquinas, if you read his commentary on the book of Romans, he talks about this law of the mind is the natural law. It says in the Psalms, the light of thy countenance is shined upon us, that God has placed within our minds this light by which we might know right and wrong. This is the natural law. But then he says, but there is another law in my members, the law of sin, which fights against the law of my mind. This is what's in the tradition called the law of sin, or the law of concupiscence, which we know what's good, but then this law fights against it and causes us to go away from what is good, to seek only purely earthly goods, which ultimately won't satisfy us, but still are... We all have this feeling at times, right? Where, all right, I shouldn't go eat food right now. I know that the purpose of food is to satisfy my hunger, and I'm not hungry right now, but I would really like another bag of potato chips. And I'm giving this example because I'm terrible about not eating potato chips. And so I have this desire within me, but I know in my mind that that's not what I ought to be doing. And so this is fighting against me. And even on a natural level, we would still have these lower desires. But because of the fall, these natural desires actually come to rule over our mind so that we can no longer regulate our proper things. And so this is the first reason that we need the church to help save us. And so Paul will talk about this, where he says, God has sent the Spirit into our hearts. That's the Holy Spirit that gives us the grace so that we might do what is right. And as well, he also talks there about a fourth law, about the law of Moses, what God gives. And we can go into that in a little bit, about why it's important that God gives the Torah in this system. But he gives us grace so that we might be able to do what's right. But there's also a second reason as well, which is that only God can really satisfy our heart, and God is beyond even our natural capacities. And this is something that's really profound when you actually grasp it. Right? Think of the greatest good you can possibly think of, and God infinitely exceeds that good. That God infinitely exceeds our capabilities. And there's no possible way with any natural goods that we could reach God. It would be like asking us to walk to the moon. Right? So you can, right, let's say, for example, you could walk to the store, and this might be, or you could say walk to the other side of the earth. That might be seeking natural happiness. Right? It's very, very difficult to achieve, but it is possible.
So just to pop in on that point, so the Catholic Church does not teach that on your own you are good and can achieve your own salvation without God's grace.
No, absolutely not. This is the heresy of Pelagianism, is that because of the fall, we're able to do some goods. So it's not the case that we can't do any good, but we can't be perfectly virtuous on our own. Because of the fall, the law of concupiscence is always going to take over us. And so we need to seek God's grace to help us. And so but even, let's say, for example, right, the fall hadn't happened and God had created us, but had never really intervened in the world. Then we would be able to, say, reach natural happiness, but we would not be able to truly reach the supernatural happiness that would truly satisfy us. Because it would be like asking someone to walk to the moon. So the equivalent of grace here is like a spaceship that takes you above. Not only you need an airplane will help you get to the other side of the earth, but you could theoretically try to get there by other means. So that would be like natural goods. But supernatural goods, we are unable to achieve even naturally, right? So the fall, you could think of as cutting your legs off. That now you can't even walk to the other side of the world. But if you had your legs, you could walk there. But you still wouldn't be able to walk to the moon. And so in order to really satisfy the deepest desires of our heart, and not even our heart, right? Because Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, he says, God has in store, or ear has not seen, eye has not seen and ear has not heard the things that God has in store for those who love him. Think about every good that you seek here in this world, right? And think about all those goods only exist because God created them. And so that means those goods, that satisfaction that you get from those goods, are in an infinitely higher degree in God. Because these goods are in a finite mode in the created things, but they're infinitely in God. So every good that we could possibly think of, infinitely beyond that, is in God. This is really profound when you deeply meditate upon this. And so this is the other reason that we need the church, is to reach these other higher goods. And so because we're in this supernatural world, because God made us in a world, God could have made a world of pure nature where God created us and then didn't really intervene in the world after that. But we see from the very beginning in Scripture that God made man in order to walk alongside him in the garden there. And so God desires us to live alongside them. And so going back to this discussion then of societies, the church is there in part to help us get to heaven, the supernatural level, but it's also there at a natural level as well to help us, to help repair what has fallen in the world. And so things like family and political societies, and even other societies we form, like clubs, for example, or businesses or other such things. These are what we call voluntary societies because we freely come together to make them, but they're important, of course, to a flourishing political community. These goods become fallen on account of the fall. Right? We see this as well in the story in Genesis. That right, man sins, and what is the first thing they do? Immediately, Adam and Eve start blaming one another for everything. We see division, but not only is man divided from God, but man becomes divided from man, and we see this become worse and worse with every generation. Right? That Cain goes and kills Abel. And then he goes off and he founds this city, which I've always sort of imagined sort of this great society of slavery and so on. And St. Augustine will talk about this, that in the beginning, God gave man dominion over all the animals and over all the plants, but he did not give man dominion over other men. And so even things like slavery become introduced on account of the fall as men become divided from one another. And then additionally, man's relationship with the creation becomes harmed. Right, that God tells Adam in the curses in Genesis 3 that now when he works the ground, it'll yield thorns and thistles from him, and by the sweat of his brow he will make bread, that it becomes harder for him to work. And after Cain kills Abel, it becomes the case that now God tells Cain that now the ground will not yield forth its produce for him. And so man's sin not only affects his relationship with God and with his neighbor, but also with the whole creation. And this is really the foundation of Catholic social teaching, is that the church has come to heal man's relationships with one another, so that way we can live in proper relationship with one another, relationship with God, and in a relationship with the creation. That God has this intention to restore the whole of creation. And so God, he sort of has this twofold plan by which he saves the world. He first comes and gives Moses a written law. This is what sometimes called in Catholic social teaching the Old Law. And it has three parts to it. There is what's called the moral law. And this is simply a reiteration of the natural law for us. So it's wrong. Not only is it wrong for Jews to murder another human, it's wrong for any person to murder another human. So whereas in Jewish theology, this is founded upon the Noahide laws, as in a set of positive laws God gives to Noah. In the Catholic tradition, this is actually something rooted deeper in human nature, what we call natural law. And this is reiterated to us in the Ten Commandments. So no humans ever totally forgot this sort of inclination to know God or to know a higher good and to live in society.
And I think it's important to note there that in the Jewish worldview of things, that is separate from the covenant with Israel. Mm-hmm. Whereas and correct me if I'm wrong here, in Catholic teaching or in Christian teaching in general, that is not a separate covenant for people that are not the real covenant. It's part of the basic natural order of things, not a second covenant for people that don't have the responsibility or relationship with God.
Exactly, yeah, because people had sort of lost parts of the natural law. So actually something fascinating I found when I was doing some reading on this recently that Aquinas points out is that many, Aquinas points out that the Germans thought that stealing was only wrong. This is the ancient, pagan Germans, so Julius Caesar talks about this, that they thought stealing was only wrong towards other Germans, but it was fine to go raid other tribes and steal from them. So this is an example of how part of the natural law was sort of forgotten by humanity. Or now we can see nowadays, right, that people now think it's okay to kill a human if they're not fully formed yet. But we know obviously it's wrong to murder someone in any situation. And so there are parts of the natural law that can sort of be forgotten. And the most fundamental principle of the natural law, though, that sort of no one can ever lose, is to do good and avoid evil. Right? So let's say, for example, you have a serial killer, right? And they've lost this idea that killing is wrong. They don't think in their heart that killing is wrong. But they're still seeking a good when they kill someone, which is that they get pleasure from killing other people. And so in killing other people, they're actually seeking the good. Now, it's a very, very disordered good, obviously, because they're not properly ordering the goods. They're letting this desire to murder people take over them. But they're still seeking a good. No one acts except for some perceived good, even if it's a very, very disordered good. And so we have written laws against murder, in part just to restrain the person, to physically stop them from doing it, but also that law is a teacher, right? Paul talks about it. He says the law was given to Israel as a pedagogue. So that way, it might be that when they're restrained from murdering, they will come to realize that murder is actually wrong. And this actually affects all of us. So if you look, for example, with the whole issue of same-sex quote-unquote marriage, it was generally seen as immoral by most people until it was legalized. So Catholic social teaching is very opposed to the libertarian idea that we ought to be able to do whatever we want. You obviously can't stop all evils. The purpose of human law is not to stop all evils. It's up to us to choose to do right and wrong, but the written law actually serves to habituate our minds in right and wrong. And so it's very important that we be habituated in this. And so when God gave the moral law to ancient Israel, it was to habituate them in what is right and wrong. But then God also gave ceremonial precepts and judicial precepts as well. So the ceremonial precepts, we have this inclination to know God, but the natural law doesn't fully specify it, right? So should I worship God on a Saturday or a Sunday or once a month? How should I do that? Right, I need to offer some sort of sacrifice to God to show my honor towards him. Well, what sort of sacrifice do I offer? You can look anywhere you want in nature, and nature is it's going to tell you that you need to worship God. Every society in history has been religious in some way. Even nowadays in modern society, right? There's certain taboo things you can't talk about and you can't criticize. And so that's sort of the religion of modern society that you have to give honor towards and give sacrifice towards. But every society has some sort of religion and religious ritual. And so in order to habituate Israel away from idolatry, God gave them certain ceremonial precepts to show them the true virtue of religion. And as well, these also had a symbolic function to foreshadow the work that Christ was going to do. In addition to this, he also gave judicial precepts. And this is an important point as well, is that just as, right, you can know, for example, it's wrong to murder, but what ought to be the punishment for murder? Right? Should there be mitigating factors based on people's disposition and other things, right? You can't find somewhere in nature that's going to prescribe you the exact punishment that ought to be done for murder. So we create human laws that are going to define this. Another thing, for example, is that the government, right? We know there needs a political community because we naturally live in political societies, and the government needs money in order to function. So clearly, there's going to need to be some sort of tax system. Now, what should the taxes be? Clearly, it can't be zero because it needs some sort of money. It would clearly be wrong if a king came around and took all your money and used that to just buy alcohol to drink. So it's clearly wrong for that money to be taken and not be spent towards the common good. But should that tax rate, say, be 10% or 15% or 20%? There's nothing in nature that is going to tell you that.
That's what most modern politicians do, by the way. They take all your money and they buy alcohol with it.
Exactly. And so I want to be clear that Catholic social teaching is not saying like government corruption and stuff is a really good thing or something like that. But we need some sort of money in order for the government to function. And so we create positive laws. I think another great example of the need for positive law is what should a traffic light show when you stop? So clearly you need some sort of signal when you get to an intersection so that people do not collide. But do you stop on red, or do you stop on green, or do you stop on purple? Clearly there needs to be some sort of positive law that the government is going to determine in order to have a rule. And so there needs to be some specifications of law by the proper political authority. And so this was part of the purpose of the judicial law, is that God gave an example to mankind of sort of what a good legal system looks like. And so even now, like St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, talks about how actually it would be really good for politicians to study the Torah in order to know what good laws look like. And he actually has a long section where he talks about how the Torah actually meets up to Aristotle's explanation of what an ideal society looks like. So he doesn't actually point to like ancient Greece. He says the Greeks didn't live up to their own philosophical ideas of what an ideal society looks like. But Israel did, because this was an order given by God. Now, with some exceptions, obviously there's still people who were bad, and as well, God made some concessions.
Aside from murdering the prophets, but yeah.
Yeah, and as well, God gave concessions to them. So, for example, it's wrong to give usury to any person, but God permitted giving usury to foreigners in order to sort of move that out. Or slavery is bad in any situation, but God sort of gave rules to make sure you treat your slaves nicely and have to free them after a certain amount of time to habituate people to the idea that slavery is wrong. Similar issue with divorce and other things. But this is still...
I think an important point, if I may, there's a lot of... So the idea of the progressive revelation throughout the Bible, right, which in the Jewish world is like, no, this is eternally for this moment and then all time, not understanding that, well, why don't you still kill Amalekites? Why don't you still have slaves, right? Well, we're not allowed to, so you would have slaves if you could. It's like, no. In order to actually have a moral order that we know now to be the real moral order, you have to understand it as progressively advancing and improving the nature of mankind over time. Not just like, oh, this is the thing now, and then it's for all time, even if we break the covenant as much as we want, but you, God, are still obligated to us with this covenant to this ethnic group. So obviously you need that progressive revelation in order for that moral nature of mankind to advance altogether, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is meant to sort of give us an example of God redeeming this one nation, ultimately to give an example of the redemption of the whole world. That God's plan is not merely, we can get in a little bit to the role of nations within Catholic social teachings. There's very profound things to say about that. But God's ultimate plan is to redeem all of humanity. And so, yes, the laws given, the Torah is very good. It's a very, very good thing, but it was not perfect. It was given for an imperfect people in order to bring them to a higher perfection. So at this time, we can very clearly see, if you just read the Tanakh, all the issues that mankind still continued to face even after the giving of the Torah. This did not perfect mankind. And so we ultimately see throughout the Tanakh, this is the written law. It can teach us, it can habituate our minds to right and wrong, but it could not infuse into us grace. It could not actually cause us to act rightly. And so this is where Christ comes, and he offers himself as a sacrifice in order to atone for our sins, and then sends the Holy Spirit to us to redeem us, so that way we can have the grace to act right. Now, when we receive grace, we still have a fallen nature. And so that fallen nature is still going to be fighting against that. So in this life, we're never going to be completely perfected. But we ought to continue to work with God's grace to move closer to that perfection that we ought to seek. That Jesus commands us. He says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And so we ought to seek that perfection that God calls us to. And so, yeah, this whole framework, though, for thinking about societies really has very important things to teach us about our social order that does not neatly fall into, say, Democrat or Republican. It also doesn't have the answers to every question. As I mentioned earlier, right? It can't tell us what tax code we ought to have, but it can give us the moral principles that we ought to use to think about politics. In the way here, I want you to pull up, there's a great section. Let me see if I can find it. Here we go. Here we go. Pulling up, this is... Here we go. Yes, this is from a document called Lumen Gentium, or not Lumen Gentium, sorry, Gaudium et Spes, which was a long document the church put out in at the Second Vatican Council in the wake of World War II. Now, a lot of people have this idea that because...
Do you want to pull it up on your screen, or do you want to just read from it?
Yeah, I can pull it up on my screen here. Here we go. I'm just going to pull it. Let me control. Can I pull it up? Here we go. Cool. Let me pull it up on. Yeah. So a lot of people have this idea that the Second Vatican Council was this like liberal council because it was happening in the wake of World War. It's happening during the 1960s and so on, when sort of all these cultural changes were happening. But if you actually read the documents, there's some really profound things in the documents of Vatican II. And there's this great line in it I love that says, let me go. Laymen should also know that it is generally the function of a well-formed Christian conscience to see that the divine law is inscribed in the life of the earthly city. From priests they may look for spiritual light and nourishment. Let the layman not imagine that his pastors are always such experts that to every problem which arises, however complicated, they can readily give him a concrete solution, or even that is such as their mission. Rather, enlightened by Christian wisdom and giving close attention to the teaching authority of the church, let the layman take on his own distinctive role. So it is not the purpose of the church to say, become economists, right? There's an important purpose in society for economists to study how certain economic policies will lead to certain outcomes. But it is the teaching of the church to help us think about what sorts of outcomes that we want to see, so that way the church we can seek those sorts of good outcomes, right? That the church gives us the moral principles, but it's the job of lay people in their duties to properly implement those. Now, there are certain things that we can know in all cases. These are what we call intrinsic evils that can never be accepted. So, for example, murder is an intrinsic evil. There is never a time in which murder can be tolerated. Right? And this would include even the murder of unborn children as well. But what sorts of punishments we ought to have, right? So we could have a police state where the church has a camera, the government has a camera on every corner to immediately check if someone's about to murder someone, and never let anyone have any item which someone might murder someone. That would be a terrible society to live in. So what sorts of policies we ought to use to prevent murders is not going to be something the church can prescribe. But if you have a politician, say, advocating for making child murder legal, as most politicians in America do, that would obviously be something the church would have to be vocal against. And if one politician says, don't murder children, another one says murder children, you can't say, oh, well, I like some of the economic policies of the one who says murder children. Like, that's not an acceptable reason to vote for the one who wants to murder children. And likewise as well, something like marriage, as we see, is so foundational to human society that it's very important that marriage is properly defined by the government. It's not up to the government to say that, for example, two men coming together can be counted as a marriage. That's very contrary to such a foundational principle of human society. Here we go. And so the first thing that's really foundational of what the church teaches on this moral thing is a great work people should read called The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, that was put out under the pontificate of St. John Paul II. And it sort of goes through the basics of Catholic social teaching. And so I'm just sort of using it here as a guide of various topics to go through. And the first topic it mentions that's really foundational is the family. That it's not the individual that's the basic building block of society, but the family, right? That the fundamental principle of liberalism, which is the philosophical system that underlies the modern world. And by liberalism here, I mean this philosophical system, not just the modern left. The modern right is just as much founded on liberalism as the modern left. And what the fundamental principle of liberalism is that the purpose of politics is to maximize human freedom. That as long as you're not harming someone else, you should do whatever you want. Well, the problem with that is that we don't come into the world as these sort of automatons. We are born in a family and we are nurtured in a family until we become an adult. And that family that we are born into is going to shape us in these deep ways. Now, someone who sort of took liberalism to its most extreme is this philosopher named Murray Rothbard, who had this idea of anarcho-capitalism, that we should essentially get rid of government and replace everything with the free market. But he ended up with a fundamental issue. What do you do with children? Like something like child abuse. And so he suggests, well, maybe if there's child abuse, the child could run away or something like that and then assert their own rights. And so there's no place in his system really for a child to really fit in. That's obviously absurd. You could also think about this as well, that right, some people nowadays want to say that we shouldn't teach children religion. We should wait until they're 18 and they can choose their religion for themselves. And now you could even choose your gender for yourself when you turn 18. They shouldn't raise people with it. Well, imagine if we took this to its extreme. Should we not teach children, say, language? Right? You can't teach a child a language when they're 18. We introduce them to every language and they can choose which language they want to speak. Right? This is obviously absurd. We naturally are come into the world as living in families. And so it's important that families be properly ordered. And now, this is sort of a very, very controversial point in Catholic teaching, but it's so fundamental to everything, which is that the fundamental purpose of marriage is the procreation and education of children. Now, there is a secondary end, which is very, very important, of the of the good of the spouses towards one another, and the spouses seeking one another's help to get to heaven. But the fundamental principle that the reason that God instituted marriage was so that way we could be fruitful and multiply. That God makes man male and female and says, be fruitful and multiply. And this has been fundamentally destroyed by the introduction of contraception into society. I would highly recommend everyone go read Pope St. Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae. This was sort of in the wake of all these changes going on in the 1960s, the Pope put together a commission to look into, should the church start allowing contraception? And sort of to everyone's shock, St. Paul released the statement, this is St. Paul VI, the Pope, released the statement Humanae Vitae, saying that contraception is contrary to the proper ends of the marital act. People can get what I mean by the marital act there. And this is what has habituated us to think about. It has habituated us to think about the marital act as no longer being the marital act, that it is now about simply seeking pleasure. And as long as you are not harming anyone with it, you should be able to seek as much pleasure as you want. Right? And so now we can even go so crazy, right? As you can even change what your sexual organs should be if you would like to, if that's the way you want to seek more pleasure. And now we're seeing a whole generation of young men, and I think young women very much as well, which is a crisis that's less talked about, who are addicted to pornography and fundamentally cannot relate to one another. It really does just destroy society to its core when you introduce contraception into a society. And it's sort of one of the most unknown evils that the world is facing that we don't talk about, I think, enough. But the Catholic Church called out from the beginning there very clearly, and has, I think it just changes everything. And so when you think of the purpose of the marital act is the production of children, even if it also brings about the union of the spouses, and that's an important and very good thing, that it then creates a society which is ordered towards the good of families, that we want to bring more humans into the world, that we see new children being brought up as a blessing towards our society. Or we see this constantly in scripture, that when God blesses a society, they have huge population explosions. So it's actually a sign that God's favor is with them. And if you have a population decline in scripture, that's a sign that God's wrath is upon that nation. And just go look up the birth rates right now in the world if you want to see how that's affecting things. And so we have to seek these good of families as well. Now we have the whole issue of that people aren't even being able to meet other people to properly have families in the first place. You have this whole crisis of like the incels and so on, of people who are not properly disposed to be able to meet someone of the other sex, so that way they can start a family.
Does Groyperism violate the Catholic Church's rules against contraception by default?
No comment. But I do think people get mad at like young things like the Groypers and stuff like that. I do think it's almost more of a symptom than it is the fundamental crisis. Because I think what we're seeing now is we had generations, right, of all these crises, and then young white men being told they're the problem with sort of everything in society, and that everything in past history has to be denigrated, that Christianity has to be denigrated, that white men have to be denigrated. And so now you're seeing sort of this backlash to that I think is in many ways the result of these false ideas being spread. And so that's why I see it. It's very much, I think, a symptom of the problem. And this is the case all over the case, right? As well, things like transgenderism and other things. These are all symptoms of a fundamental underlying problem, which is that modern society for the last few hundred years have been built upon lies. And we're now in the stages of seeing it all collapse. I was speaking with a priest about this a few days ago, and he made a great point that in COVID, we all put the masks on, but the mask on society came off. That there was a fundamental rot to the bottom of society. And what happened because of COVID is this was revealed.
Do you know what COVID made me think of during that whole time? Did you ever see the Dark Knight, the second Batman movie?
A long time ago.
So when the Joker's is talking to, I forget who he's talking to, but he says these so-called civilized people, like at the first chance, like they'll eat each other, like literally. That's what COVID reminded me of. I saw people that were giddy about the idea of turning in their neighbors and getting them in trouble. And it was just like, it was horrifying, because I'm like, you would go further than that. Like whoever's doing that, given the chance, would do worse. It was only the first step.
Yeah. And so I think what we saw there, right, is that there was some fundamental problem, and now also the expert class was exposed as like not really knowing anything. And so now everything's up for grabs. Right now we're discussing like flat earth and stuff seriously. But that's come about because of more underlying issues that sort of led to these problems here. And I think what Catholic social teaching has is to restore sanity to the world, is that now everything is up for grabs, right? And you're seeing young people with a desire for this, right? They're talking about this phrase, Christ is King. And so what we need to ask them is, all right, Christ is King. I agree with that. What does that mean? Because Christ is King has almost now become this sort of virtue signal on the right. And it's a great phrase, but we should take up everything that's actually meant by Christ as King, which doesn't neatly fall into sort of any modern ideology, whether you want to use it for a left-wing ideology or right-wing ideology or whatever you would like to use it for.
Would you say that, being that the Catholic view and the Christian view in general is that Christ is the Lord, that saying Christ is King for the purpose of virtue signaling violates the Ten Commandments, taking the Lord's name in vain?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is a huge issue, is that
they don't realize that.
It's a huge issue. Now, and when you call this out, because I've called this out before publicly, what you get is people saying, using it properly, being like, oh, why are you attacking this? Well, I'm not attacking people who are using it properly. When I critique it, the problem is the way in which it's misused, right? And this is, I think, is where about some people want to attack the phrase Christ is King, but I think it's better to call people about it. What are actually the implications of Christ is King, right? I remember, for example, Andrew Tate tweeting out like Christ is King. This is like a Muslim pornographer tweeting out Christ is King. Like if Christ were king, and we treated it that, obviously Christ is king, but if we implemented that in our society, like it would not be good for Andrew Tate. Well, it would actually be very good for his soul, or he would be hopefully given some coercion to rethink his life. But he would, it would not be good for his temporal gain, let's say. Instead of going on then to the next important thing is human work. As we see, man from the beginning is called to work the earth. And each individual cannot produce everything they need, right? Like even people, like I do some like, I have some land, so I do some stuff around my own. There's no way I could survive for like even a week without other people knowing lots of other stuff of how to do. We are made as finite beings. And so
Can I
We
interrupt
cannot
for a
provide. Yeah.
moment, just because I've been watching the chat and there's somebody who's having a back and forth, and I'm letting them just do it. But I want to point something out here because when I see this, I think they're referencing something with the priests and the scandal, right?
Mhm.
Um, Even considering if you were to take double the number that it actually was, you're as a child 15 times, I think, more likely to be abused, let's call it, by a doctor or a public school teacher than a Catholic priest, even if you doubled the number of what was given during that scandal. So, why do you have a problem with the Catholic Church, but not every single other institution where adults are with children?
And historically, if you go read old church canons and stuff, if a priest was caught doing that, they would be immediately executed. Now, the church decided to listen to modern psychologists who gave very bad advice that, oh, it's only a connection with this child and it just moves them to another parish, it will go away. And so it's really the fact that the church tried to listen to like secular atheists about how they should treat these sorts of issues that led to the whole abuse crisis in the first place in many ways, which is not obviously, of course, there have probably been abuse cases throughout all of history that lots of people have, right? And if you compare the rates of the Catholic Church to other religions, it's the same or worse in pretty much every other religion. This is not to say, I think Sonia makes a real point here when she says they're men of God and took vows. This is, I think, the real scandal, is that the church did not act significantly better than everyone else. And it should not have been a single case of it. And when this happened, it should have been immediately cracked down on. So I think it is a huge scandal what happened, but it's not a, say, unique scandal to the Catholic Church, except insofar as someone wants to concede that the Catholic Church is a supernatural society instituted by God. Insofar as that's the case, and of course it's a huge scandal, that people who have an indelible mark on their soul of holy orders, who are ordained forever as priests, that even if these priests doing this are going to end up in hell, even in hell, they're still going to have the mark of being priests on their soul. And that's a horrible scandal. But it happens everywhere, unfortunately. We're in this fallen world that we're not yet perfectly redeemed. Going back to the thing about work, is that, right, man is meant to work. And this is, I think, a few important things we can get from this. There's a great encyclical on this called, I'm remembering a different name for it. Let me see. Laborum Exercens. So Laborum Exercens by St. John Paul II is a great encyclical where he points out that man is called to work the world, to have dominion over the world, in the same context in which he is called, created male and female, and told to be fruitful and multiply. That man's work is not for his own sake, but for the sake of his family. That he is meant to make enough money so that he can provide for his family. And so the church has an important principle about a just wage, that you actually can't just pay your employees whatever you want. That's not just. What a just wage is enough so that way a man on a single income can provide for his family of however many kids he has. That is what the church teaches a just wage is. Now, this does not mean so you can have as many kids as you want and get like Starbucks every morning. Obviously, if you make more money, you can have those nice luxuries of whatever you would like to do. But you need to have enough so that way your family can live a dignified life. And this is actually one of the first evils that the church was calling out in the Industrial Revolution, is that women were being forced into the workplace. And this does not mean that a woman can never do any work and stuff. And we have some people, you'll see some tribes claim that, but we have like a canonized saint who was a doctor and a mother. Can't remember her name right now. So the church doesn't teach women can never do any work, but women should not be forced out of the households so that way they lose their role as mothers. A woman's duty, first and foremost, that is married and has children, is first and foremost to be a mother to her children. And so when women are forced out of the household, this brings about many grave evils. Right? Then you're forced to send your kid to school all day, and then you end up with abuse crisis of teachers and so on. That this is something very, very deep evil, is that most people nowadays are not able to provide for their families on a single income. Now, people will point out that women have always worked in history that were not rich, which is true, but it was around the household. So if you had a farm that was literally right in front of where your house sat, and the woman went out and helped in the fields some during the day, that did not take her away from her children. But in the modern world, women are taken away and put in the context of the modern workplace. You also end up with other issues, right? There's huge rates of, for example, infidelity and stuff that's going on in the workplace. So there's lots of issues when this family is ripped up. And this is the case somewhat for the man too, that men, right, are forced to be away from their families all the time, and so are not able to do their duties as fathers. But at the very least, if they're going to be ripped away from their family all day, they need to have enough that at least they're providing for their family. And so the purpose of the economy is not to seek the good of individuals to have as much material goods as we want. Those material goods are good things, right? And it's important that we have time to rest, that we take enjoyment in those things. And if you've ever tried to just work nonstop and don't take breaks and relax, like that's, you see you're not very productive. So it's an important thing that we have.
That's why you see so many Catholics drinking whiskey and smoking cigars.
Exactly, right? Those things are good things to have, right? It's not wrong. It says in the Psalms that God made wine to gladden the heart of man. These are good things to have. And as well, they produce other goods, right? People have great discussions over having a drink together, that it helps bring people together in fellowship. But these finite goods are meant to help us, so that way we can seek the common good of our families, we can seek the common good of our political communities, and so that way we can seek our ultimate good, which is the beatific vision, to be with God, to have the highest good. And so the economy is only good when it's ordered to that end. The purpose of the economy is not so that way you can just have as many earthly pleasures as you would like. But it's also, work gives us a certain dignity. So it would also be a bad thing if the government just gave us handouts, so that way we could just live off handouts, right? So obviously it's a lot better that you have some sort of charity so you don't starve to death than for you and your family to starve to death. But it's much better that you can work and be dignified, right? People who just live on welfare often end up with all sorts of spiritual issues because they're not able to do what it is to be a man and provide for their family. And so that actually does a lot of harm to the person. And so really the ideal of what the church wants is, yes, to provide some charity to people, but ultimately to get them off their feet, so that way they can be able to work. And it's also a good thing the church encourages the people owning property, that ownership actually gives some dignity to what the person is doing. Right? When you own something, you have a long-term stake in it. And we live in a world that's very much a society of renters, right? So when we build our houses, we don't imagine that like these are the houses our great-great-grandchildren are going to live in. But for a long time, people built stuff with the idea that until Christ returns, their family is going to be living here, right? And so when we own something, we have this idea that we are passing it on to a future generation. And we very much lost that as well. And that's an important principle the church is teaching on economics. And I think this doesn't neatly fit into left or right. The left wants to ultimately abolish private property. It wants to abolish the idea that the purpose of work is for the sake of the family. So it very much rips apart things. But the church also is not, say, like a free market fundamentalist. The church thinks businesses are a great thing, but there needs to be certain limitations upon them when they go too far. But to what extent those limitations should be, the church does not teach. Right? So it teaches as well, there's a principle that you can, for example, workers are not being paid enough, that they have the right to form a union to collectively negotiate for a better wage. This is something that offends a lot of people coming into the church from the right, but it is the case that the church teaches for the right of workers to unionize. Although interestingly, and I've only very limited sense, not really the right to strike. You can look in various encyclicals in this, like Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno and others. But there is a right when people to have it. But the church actually encouraged Catholics to form their own unions because these unions were being run by socialists that were often opposed to virtues of religion and family, and ultimately wanted to encourage class warfare. And the church's idea is that the various classes ought to work together. So it should not be the case that the poor ought to rise up against the rich and like, oh, this is the whole, right, the idea of eat the rich and stuff you have in the modern left that encourages resentment. And this is a very bad thing, is that we ought to seek we ought to love others. And so we should not be encouraging resentment against one another.
Jealousy is a powerful drug.
Exactly. And so socialism, it sort of offers what seems in the solution to man's problems, but actually offers a far worse poison than the modern world. But there are certain limitations upon the economy that ought to be imposed by the government. All right. I think around here, I talked about the political community quite a bit, but an important point I think I should add about the political community, and this is offensive to the modern world, is that the church does not teach that a certain form of political authority is required by divine law. So we have a sort of democratic republic here in America, and that's perfectly acceptable. That is a acceptable form of government in the eyes of the church. But other societies, say, have monarchy or dictatorship or other things, and the church has no opposition to this. And this is very offensive to modern people. But democracy in itself is not a good. Democracy can be a means towards a good, but it is not in itself necessarily a good. Now, interestingly, according to Aristotle, I mentioned earlier, he actually noted how monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, they each have some advantages to them. Right, so when a monarchy can be very efficient in getting things done, and it can be directed towards one good, but if you have a bad king and becomes a tyrant, that's like the worst possible situation you could end up in. Now you have an evil leader who there's no restraint on. Likewise, with a democracy, right, it can have very much limitations upon the leadership of one people, but most people are not very capable of making good political decisions, let's say. And so when you have a democratic society and you invest the power in the people, you're not going to end up with a very good society very quickly. And so this is even noted by many of our founding fathers, right, who sought to put lots of limitations on democracy. And so Aristotle noticed, well, what if we balance them? We had a monarchy, somewhat of like an aristocracy, so we have other powerful like advisors to the king and so on, and democracy, the people have some input. But he couldn't really point to a society that really worked this way. But St. Thomas Aquinas actually points out that there was a society that was structured this way, which is ancient Israel. That God established Moses as the leader of the society, and later on, David and his descendants. But there was also the elders of the villages that had a lot of say if we read through the Torah. And as well, these elders are chosen from among the people. And so there's actually this democratic element even there in the Torah of the choosing of the leaders of the society. And we see this as well in the Catholic Church, that we have the Pope as the head of the church, but we also have the College of Bishops as his advisors. And then as well, the laity actually have a role in the church as well. The church is not just the clergy, but all of the laity as well. And so when Jesus came, he instituted a society that is actually structured on the ideal society. And then we see this in America as well. The founding fathers actually were reading these people talking about this, such as Aristotle and Polybius. And so if you look at America, we have the president as a sort of monarch. Then we have the Senate, and as well as originally, or should we read the judiciary, and originally the Senate, which was elected by the states, not the people directly. This sort of served as aristocracy. And then we also elected directly the our House of Representatives. So the American government is actually structured based around this ideal society. And this is actually noted by popes. So Pope Leo XIII, we mentioned earlier, he had some critiques of America that he called Americanism, which was basically people putting being American above being Catholic. So a lot of trads will note this, but he also has an encyclical where he praises the founding fathers and the Constitution for this wise design. And so I think this is something as Americans we should be looking at. It's actually very much a good thing that was given to us. And then also political communities are almost always centered around some sort of national identity that sort of politically incorrect way is based on ethnicity. Now, we do not mean necessarily race in a modern sense of like being white or black or so on, but is based on sort of a heritage that is passed on from one generation to another. I think this is difficult for us to think about as Americans because in America, we are in this very multi-ethnic society. And so I think how exactly this applies to America could be a whole different discussion. But for most societies in history have been based around sort of a certain ethnicity. But there have also always been minority communities that have lived among them. And the church teaches the need that it's a good that actually are national identities are a good thing, that the virtue of patriotism can be a very good thing, that we ought to hold on to. We have to honor our father and mother, which includes our whole and all our ancestors. But we also ought to keep that in check. And so we need to properly treat the foreigner among us. This is mentioned again and again and again in the Torah, right? That you should treat the foreigner as yourself. You have to have one law, both for the foreigner who resides among you and for the native Israelite. But there's a great section Thomas Aquinas talks about this, that he notes there are immigration restrictions in the Old Testament, right, in the Torah. So it mentions, for example, based on whether you were, say, an Egyptian or an Edomite or whatever, you could come and live in Israel, but you could not become part of the assembly, right, become part of the people of Israel until a certain number of generations. So we need to treat the foreigner among us well. That actually it's a very, very grave sin to mistreat the foreigners, not show proper hospitality. But this does not mean you have to open up your whole society and sort of let foreigners rule your society. Right? St. Thomas, he talks about, he's a great line here. I'm going to pull it up here when he's talking about this. And this is in the Prima Secundae of the Summa Theologiae, question 105, if people want to look this up. Here we go. Have it on
I
here.
always
Here we
tell
go.
people when talking about Aquinas, when I first, I was reading Aquinas long before I ever was interested in Catholicism, just because he's brilliant. Not that I could get through much of it at a time,
Yeah.
but I would joke with people I liked using his formula. I forget the word for it, but there's like a specific term for that formula.
Oh, yeah, we have the objections and then the reply, and then,
So I used to make little formulas like that about why only one sock would come out of the dryer of the pair.
Now, I sat next to a friend in a medieval philosophy class, and we would write stuff back and forth to one another with various objections and trying to come up with like arguments that obviously had like a flaw in them, but would be real funny as a result of it. But yeah, Aquinas says here, and this is, we asked basically, does the Torah, he says the old law, but Jews would call the Torah, prescribe the proper relations of Israel towards foreigners? And he gives the answer that it is, because there's two relations you can have with foreigners, either peaceful or hostile. And he's talking here about peaceful, so peaceful immigrants. He talks about, it says, you shall not molest the stranger, but also says you have to put in these laws about how many generations. And the reason he gives for this is he says the reason for this was that if foreigners were allowed to meddle with the affairs of a nation as soon as they settled down in its midst, many dangers might occur, since foreigners not yet having the common good firmly at heart might attempt something hurtful to the people. And we see this right now, for example, right? We have Mamdani running for mayor of New York, who clearly doesn't really see himself as an American, taking over one of the most important cities in America and having this large population of people who don't have the common good at heart voting for him. And so probably shouldn't have gotten that directly political here. I try to stay in the principles. But we can see, right, that there's a significant issue when you have huge numbers of people coming into a society who are then making political decisions for that society. And this is, I think, the whole heart of the false dilemma put in, right? That you have one side of the political aisle saying we need to take in as many people and we have to completely destroy our society, and the other ones saying we should use like as harsh means as possible to get rid of everyone from our society who's not from here. And actually both of those are very bad solutions to the problems we face. And I think really the fundamental issue at heart is this problem. This is my personal opinion, and disagree with it, is the problem of birthright citizenship, that anyone can come in and then become a citizen quite easily, and their children will automatically become citizens. And so there's no proper way to balance these two, I think, right now in America. But yes, and then as well, we have the individuals, but we also have the international community. And so the church does teach that there are moral principles that apply not only at the individual level of nations, but at the level of the international community. And actually, the church was very influential in setting up the United Nations and the European Union. Now, unfortunately, both of those organizations have gone completely off. But in their original ideas, they're actually very good things, that nations ought to come together and seek the good of one another. And the church also...
It's almost like the road to hell is paved with good intentions or something
exactly,
like that.
Yeah. And I think there was a fundamental issue with the attitude of much of the hierarchy after World War II, that we saw the sort of grave evils that were happening, and the world recognized like how horrible like what happened during World War II was and sought to change it. and often caught up with the signs of the times, of this idea of, okay, now we're going to have maybe Christian moral principles will pervade society, but they'll be in a sort of indirect way. And that we're going to create this officially secular society, but will be indirectly influenced by Christianity. And it turns out that doesn't work at all. Like, you have to have the Christian principles be explicit in society. And this is even there in the documents of Vatican II. So I quoted earlier from, what was it? Gaudium et Spes. But there's another document here, Dignitatis Humanae. Here we go. Which is the document on religious freedom. The church does teach on this, that there is a certain sense of right to religious freedom. It's not an absolute right to religious freedom. But there is a limited right to it. And it mentions here, though, in the first section, it says, religious freedom, in turn, which men demand is necessary to fulfill their duty to worship God, has to do with immunity from coercion in civil society. Therefore, it leaves untouched the traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies towards the true religion and the one Church of Christ. So the Catholic Church still teaches that all governments have a duty towards the true faith, that ultimately, this is not to say we should go in and stop other people from having their religions and so on, but ultimately, not all religions are equal to one another, and there is truth and there is falsehood and so on. And it's important that we recognize that even at the political level. And this can implement itself in different ways at different times. I'm not saying we ought to return necessarily to the medieval setup of how societies relate, where we see at different times in history, church and state have different relations, and they're meant to be different societies, but they still ought to relate to one another. And the pattern the church has given us for the modern world is that, I quoted earlier from Gaudium et Spes, that the church, through its social teaching, gives us the moral principles, and then we as the laity implement those principles in the political order. And then as well, another thing that I think offends a lot of people coming at the church from the right as well, is the church teaches that we actually do have a moral duty towards the environment. I mentioned earlier, right, about
grinds my gears a little bit, but I'll let you go with it.
I'll go with it. I'm going to win you over on this one, and you can debate me on if I don't win you over to it.
Yeah, I get the difference between what the church teaches and what the wacky left version of it is, but it feels like it's too. I sometimes feel that it's pandered to in that way, but I'll shut my mouth now because I'm not teaching.
Well, I think you can make a legitimate critique of sometimes the hierarchy can be a bit tone deaf. Like sometimes, obviously it's older people leading it. So sometimes bishops are thinking of how things were like 20, 30, 40 years ago when they grew up and when they were formed. And they've forgotten that it used to be that society didn't change that quickly.
Right.
But now
so Pope Leo is thinking like, oh, let's not litter our garbage in the park. And people are hearing him talk about the environment, thinking that he's promoting like that we shouldn't eat meat anymore as a race of humans.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you think about go online and find like old internet blogs from the Obama era, and it literally feels like you are reading something from multiple centuries ago with just how different it was in the Obama years. Like society is changing so rapidly, but I think we do have to think about a better way for like bishops to be more up to date on what's really going on in the world. Because I think this is the biggest thing, is we have the right principles, but sometimes we're very tone deaf. I think this is the case in immigration as well. The church is legitimately concerned about indignity being done towards immigrants, but like that's not the fundamental issue that's being faced. Much more frequently, we're facing the issue nowadays that like entire societies are being replaced. I was in Vienna a year ago, and you walk around Vienna and you would think you walked into Saudi Arabia or something. Like the world is fundamentally, societies are being replaced by immigration in a way the church has to think about, and could actually, I think, if it did that, speak much better to the modern right, which I think is in certain ways not considering the human dignity of immigrants enough in its actions.
It just occurred to me why you chose Vienna.
I was not thinking anything, but
wasn't that the famous battle where they held off the
was that?
Islamic conquest?
No, I was just actually in Vienna.
Oh no, that's isn't. I thought that was the famous battle where they finally held off the Muslim conquest and pushed them back. Was Vienna,
I was in
the Battle of Vienna?
I was in Vienna, and I saw this like huge group of Muslims protesting about a certain conflict in the Middle East that will remain nameless. And thinking like, this is not, how does this have to do with Vienna at all? But right outside, a giant, beautiful medieval cathedral. In this cathedral, it looked like a skyscraper. It was so big. Well, inside the cathedral, they were having like a rock concert. And so
When they say river to the sea, they mean from the Mediterranean to whatsoever's on the other side of Vienna.
I'm not going to comment on the certain conflict. I've interviewed people on both sides of it if people would like to see stuff on my channel. But there was a certain sort of replacing, I think the church is very tone deaf to. And I think it's the same thing with the environment, right? There's sort of these crazy environmentalists going on that want to destroy society that are often not being discussed by the hierarchy. But the fundamental principles which the church gives us, I think, are actually really important. So in let's see. Yeah, so when we see, right, when Adam sins, the ground begins to bring forth thorns and thistles. He has to work in a sweat. That there's a damage done between Adam and his relationship with the earth. And we see this well between Cain and Abel, that when Cain kills Abel, his brother's blood cries to him from the ground, and the ground will not yield forth his fruit towards him anymore. And so he has to go out and sort of have this city and dominate over other people and use technology as a means of control, because he's now destroyed his relationship with the natural world. And likewise, when the flood comes, the flood actually comes forth from the earth to prosecute him, that the whole ground is filled with violence. And if people are saying that, like, oh, you're just coming up with this like liberal reinterpretation of the church on this, go read, here we go, Laudato Si, which was Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment, and go to, I think it's starting at paragraph 66. Starting at paragraph 65, is when Pope Francis discusses the theological roots of environmentalism. And he actually says everything I'm saying here and a lot more. Anyway, when God becomes man, he actually takes up the natural world into himself. He takes on physical matter in the incarnation. And in the resurrection, God will actually resurrect our bodies even. I was talking earlier about St. Thomas Aquinas. He actually talks about that if our souls went to heaven, we would be perfectly happy in our soul, but we would not actually be perfectly fulfilled as humans. Because what it means to live as a human is to be an embodied creature. And so actually God resurrects our bodies so that way we can have the perfection of our human nature. And he's actually going to restore the whole cosmos. We find ourselves in a relationship to the whole cosmos. And so it's very important that we properly relate to the environment. And so there's sort of two extremes here that the church rules out when it's talking about environmentalism. We have on the one hand left-wing environmentalism. And that the fundamental problem, this is actually the problem with both left and right-wing environmentalism, is it assumes that man is not part of the creation. Right? And so in left-wing environmentalism, what it says is that because man is not part of the rest of nature, man does things contrary to nature. You can find this, for example, in Heidegger. That Heidegger is a very important modern philosopher, was part of the Nazi Party even, but is also very influential in modern philosophy. He talks about how it is the nature of man to act contrary to nature. And so man acts then contrary to the natural world and destroys the world. And so the left-wing solution to this problem is to get man out of the picture, or at least to limit man's capacities so that he doesn't damage the world. Versus the sort of right-wing solution to this is say, all right, man can destroy the world and sort of to hell with this world. It's not that important, right? Elon Musk says we're going to go to Mars and we're going to live on Mars instead, so we can just destroy this world and we're going to move off to Mars afterwards. And this is not at all a view of the church. The view of the church is that we ought to seek the good of this world. Now, this is not to say that the church, per se, has a teaching on climate change, right? So the church teaches that human actions there is nothing contrary to the faith that human actions might, say, cause an increase in the Earth's temperature. It does not have a teaching on whether or not that happens. Now, there are scientific advisors to the Pope who then tell him it happens, and so that's why he acts according to that principle. But if you actually go read Laudato Si', I've read through it multiple times, the entire thing, and Pope Francis is very clear at many parts that the Church does not actually teach climate change as a thing. There we go. As well, there's actually a lot of things calling out left-wing environmentalism in Laudato Si'. So I'm going to pull up, for example, here we go. There's a great line about trafficking. Here we go. This is in paragraph 91. He has a great line here. He says, I want to start at paragraph 90, right before it, where he says, this does not put all living beings on the same level, nor to deprive human beings of their unique worth and tremendous responsibility it entails. Nor does it imply a divinization of the earth, which would prevent us from working it and preventing its fragility. He's calling out here the fundamental problems of left-wing environmentalism. And then going on, beginning of paragraph 91 here, he says, it is clearly inconsistent to combat trafficking in endangered species while remaining indifferent to human trafficking, unconcerned about the poor, or undertaking to destroy another human being deemed unwanted. That's clearly a reference to abortion there. This compromises the very meaning of our struggle for the sake of the environment. It is no coincidence that in the canticle which St. Francis praises God for his creatures, he goes on to say, praise be to you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love. Everything is connected. Concern for the environment thus needs to be joined to a sincere love to our fellow human beings and an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of society. So all the other issues we face in society are not disconnected. Those cannot sort of be put below this problem of the environment and so on. That fundamentally, I think the fundamental question here is about living in harmony with nature and with the natural law. So we go back to that earlier question of contraception we were talking about. With the contraception, what does it do? It destroys the natural end of the marital act. It destroys the natural end of sexuality. And so that habituates us to think that nature is unimportant. So I actually think you cannot be an environmentalist unless you're against contraception, because the two are fundamentally intertwined, because it's the question of, are we going to love nature as God's creation, or are we going to make ourselves the masters of this world and either destroy ourselves for the sake of nature or destroy nature for the sake of ourselves? And this is really at the heart of the Church's teaching on the environment. So I'm curious, does that make you, I think a bit better of it, or what do you think now?
So I like to play a little bit tongue in cheek with that, but I get where the Church is. Again, I think a lot of it comes down to communication. I don't think you would argue that the Vatican has always the best communication with the entire world in the language that best suits them at any given time, which would probably be impossible anyways. But I liked what you were saying about how the extremism on both sides, because I think the right's extremism is in response to sorry, somebody spamming in the chat. Let's ban them. I'll let anyone say the worst possible things about anyone here because it's your opinion. But if you are going to spam, then no. Okay. I think a lot of the I can do whatever I want. I'm going to throw my garbage over here. I don't care what we do to the planet is in response to the extremism on the left, which I can sympathize with. I'm a little bit obstinate and stubborn at times myself, but I think that's where it's coming from. It's like an oppositional, like knee-jerk reaction to being pressured into a cage and going, and like the cage is not there anymore, but you're still freaked out that somebody's going to put you in it. That's what the right response to the left is there. Although I do think there are people that do that anyways on their own without any threat, going on.
Yeah, I think what the Church's social teaches is sort of, I think, is the best of both worlds. That in a certain sense, it takes us out of many of the debates that we now have sort of in modern political discourse, but also it doesn't prescribe us exact solutions. And so we shouldn't go around calling other Catholics heretics because they might disagree with us on, say, what
Right.
tax policy should be or whether they agree with us on the environment. There's actually a healthy place for political discourse in a democracy, but we need to set the proper bounds, right? So I think abortion should be acceptable, should not be an acceptable political opinion within a democracy, while I think that, I think that the tax rate should be something different, or I think a better way to combat abortion is this or that, or acceptable political opinions within a democracy. As Catholics discuss the best way to reach what we all want at the end, which is a flourishing society.
Right. And I think people misuse the term heresy a lot. Like, not everything that you say that disagrees with the church and you're in trouble for it is a heresy.
Mm-hmm.
Like that gets thrown around way too easily today.
Oh, absolutely.
Unfortunately, not at any of the heretics, but
yeah.
But is this good to take a pause and read some comments?
Maybe if I want to add, I'll add two brief little last points so we can go to comments. The first point is, whenever something comes out in the media about the church, you should have an assumption that it's wrong until proven right. And I've never once read a news article that's been proven right, so I assume it's wrong. Which is to actually go. The Vatican puts out all their documents for free. Just go to vatican.va. You can see all the news articles the church puts out every single day. But also to go to the actual documents and just read them. You read plenty of stuff in your life. You can go. You can find online programs that will read them for you, like using text-to-speech stuff. So go use a text-to-speech and put it in your rides for the next few hours. Whenever the Pope puts out a document, because you'll actually see that the church's teachings on this are much, much more profound than the news headlines will lead you to believe. I do think there's an issue sometimes, actually starting with Leo XIII, who started Catholic social teaching to be sometimes too wordy. That we sort of lost this Christian culture, and so the popes are trying to reinstill it through, like, someone called the papal encyclicals, like the Pope Substack, which is kind of like become. So I do wish sometimes things were a bit shorter, so that way more people would read them and actually learn from them. But do actually read through it, and I'd recommend starting if people are interested in getting more involved. Besides, obviously, coming to our conference, which everyone here is going to come to, of course, to go and read the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. And if you're interested in learning more, Peter Kwasniewski put together, I don't endorse everything he said, but he put together a good edited volume of the most important encyclicals on Catholic social teaching. And as well, at the beginning, he has a recommended order to read them in. And he actually recommends starting with an encyclical called Veritatis Splendor by Pope St. John Paul II, which is about the moral order. And he gives basically the principles of Catholic moral theology. Then the last point I want to bring up, which is I discussed at the beginning these two inclinations in man. And I wanted to bring up, which I'd forgotten to mention, is that the two fundamental inclinations we actually see in the teachings of Jesus when he's asked, what is, to basically sum up the law and the prophets. And what he says is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. This has two things. First of all, he's showing us here the two fundamental inclinations. And these are in the Torah itself. And we have the first and second table of the Decalogue, which gives us towards God and towards man. But as well, these give us not merely these inclinations, but to actually live them out in what's called the mode of charity. That actually our whole natural lives should be lived for the sake of the supernatural end. Right? If you go to the, it's originally in the Torah, right? The Via Hafta, right at the beginning, right, it's Meodeha, with all your resources. Hopefully I didn't just mess up my Hebrew there. But to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your resources. That all of our natural life ought to be lived for the sake of God. That ultimately, right, on our natural life, we ultimately might live some things for a natural end. But ultimately, we should be living everything that we do in our lives should be lived about with God in mind and for the sake of God, so that way our entire life becomes transformed by the virtue of charity. And in the virtue of charity, we come to love God for his own sake. So naturally, we love God, but ultimately for the fact that God is our creator, that he's going to help us and so on. But in charity, we love God for no other reason than that he is God. and that he is the highest possible good. And then we love our neighbor, not because our neighbor is going to give us some sort of benefit, not even for our neighbor's own sake, but for the sake of God. That when we come to see things, St. Bernard of Clairvaux talks about this. People are interested. You should look up a podcast called The Josiahs and their episode on the Ordo Amoris, because this is the order of love. J.D. Vance brought this up in recent politics. And J.D. Vance said, first you love your family, then you love your neighbor, and so on. And that's true. But he actually missed the most fundamental point, which is first and foremost, you love God. And when you come, they talk about the sermon by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who is known for his great love of God. And that when you come to see things from God's perspective, you see that everything exists for the sake of God. People go to my Substack. I just put up an article today on it's called The Analogy of Being. And I talk about how it's really God that we atheists will say, oh, if we'll talk about this principle, right? God doesn't exist because God doesn't act in the Bible like I think he should, right? God doesn't act in nature like I think he should. Really, the real answer is that we shouldn't exist because we don't act like God wants us to. That we don't act, God exists necessarily. There's no possible world where God doesn't exist, but we only exist because God freely chose to create us out of love. And so really, we are entirely dependent on God for our existence. It's really God who we exist in the fullest sense, and we only exist in this contingent sense. We are less real than God. God's idea of us is more real than we are in a sense, because God's idea of us exists necessarily. God knows all possible worlds, but we only actually exist because God chose to create us. And I think this is a really profound and humbling truth when you come to think about us, and I think will help us to live everything out in the mode of charity. And I'm not saying any of this because I'm living it out properly. I'm not at all, just to be clear. But I think it's the ideal that we all ought to aspire to.
Awesome. Thank you. I want to, first of all, before I get to any chats, where was it? Do you want to maybe in just 2 sentences sum up and tell anyone watching about your conference?
Yeah, so I've helped organize a conference. To make clear, I'm just the institute coordinator for this. It's called the St. Basil Institute for the Study of the Theology of Creation. I'm just the coordinator, so everything I said here on this stream, and I will say, is my own personal views that do not necessarily reflect the views of the Institute. But it is on this topic of Catholic social teaching. So it's a conference on how the theology of creation is connected to Catholic social teaching. And in the morning, we're going to have 3 really excellent talks on the history of how the theology of creation was used in Catholic social teaching. And then in the afternoon will be about various topics. We're going to have a talk on marriage, a talk on work, and then I'm going to sort of be tying everything together of why do we need to reclaim the theology of creation in Catholic social teaching today. And I think if you've seen how, from this talk, I hope you've seen that actually Catholic social teaching is really profound. And I really hope the non-Catholics in the audience have begun to see that actually there's something really deep and profound about Catholic theology. And so I invite all of you to attend and learn more. So you can use the code ASH for 50% off registration. And then as well,
and we got somebody in the chat saying they tried it already and it works and they got their tickets.
Yeah, and clergy and religious as well can sign up for free. Just send me an email. If you send me email, my email is GideonJacobLazar@gmail.com. That's first name, then JACOB Lazar@gmail. And we also have a contact us form on the website. And if you go there and send me an email, if you're clergy or religious, you can sign up for free. And I had a rabbi ask me for the code, and I gave them the clergy code. So non-Catholic clergy can get the code as well from me.
It takes Jew to explain Christianity. That's because Christianity is the Judaism that was supposed to be, right?
Yeah. And I think when you really study like Catholic teaching, it reaches the most profound levels of both what the Jews and the Gentiles received. That you see how Catholic teaching perfects everything that's in the Tanakh. So it perfects everything God gave to the Jewish people, but it also perfects everything God gave to the Gentiles. The Greeks sort of perfected speculative philosophy of Plato and Aristotle and so on. And the Romans had perfected what we call practical philosophy. They had built sort of the most perfect empire you could without religion. And the church took up the best that was in the Greek and Roman worlds and perfected it by bringing it in light of this revelation that God gave to the Jews, starting in the Tanakh and then perfected with Jesus Christ.
Thank you. That's my wife, by the way, in the chat. So
thank you.
Okay, so let's get to some supers and then some comments that I pulled up if possible here. Super chat from James Scott. 2 Catholic Jews, what are your 3 opinions? Well, the third opinion is Jesus, and he's right.
Yeah.
Seriously, good to see you two together. P.S. Pius the 7th, I think
The 12th.
means the 12th. Oh, I pulled off the doy moment. It's too late at night. Saved 860,000 Jews, according to Rabbi Pinchas Lapid. Yeah, I have family of my father's who were saved by Catholic families and returned to their Jewish relatives after the war because their parents sadly were killed in Auschwitz. But the children survived and were given to back to their families. Let's take that one away. And thank you to, I'm guessing that's Tiger, became a member. Thank you. And James Scott. Gideon, explain a few differences between SCOTUS versus Thomism. I'm a, how do you pronounce that?
Banyas
Thomist myself, but I want to hear you explain my school, wee laddie. Cheers, brother. Shalom, Yeshua is king, Miriam is queen.
All right, so I don't think there's an east, like we'd have to do a whole separate stream on this, and I'd be happy to do like a stream maybe introducing like Catholic philosophy and theology a bit more.
Absolutely.
But yeah, essentially these are sort of 2 of the largest schools of, or at least were 2 of the
we'll
largest
we'll have to tag Jay Dyer for that one. So
yeah. But
that would be fun though.
Yes, Scotism and Thomism are sort of the 2 largest schools. Thomism got a significant revival and has remained a large school, versus Scotism kind of died off and is held around by like random nerds online like me and stuff. But yeah, it was essentially Thomism follows after St. Thomas Aquinas, who was the a great theologian in the Dominican order. And Scotism, so it goes after John Duns Scotus, who was a great theologian in the Franciscan order, both sort of in the High Middle Ages. The Scotus was about 2 generations after Thomas. And yeah, there's quite a number of sort of, there's lots of areas where there's Catholic doctrine and there's complete agreement there. And then there's other areas where there is room for disagreement. So for example, one of the questions is, had man not sinned, would God still have become incarnate? So, whereas we often speak of Jesus coming to save us from our sins, but we also give other reasons that he became incarnate as well. So if you took away that reason of sin, would the other reasons still be sufficient, basically? And Thomas argues not necessarily no, but that we don't have good reason to think so. So Thomas thinks God could have become incarnate, but we don't have any reason to say that we would know he did. Versus Scotus makes an argument that actually we would know that God still would have become incarnate. Another opinion, for example, is about the sort of the relationship between the intellect and the will. That Thomists will lay much more of a role in the intellect in our making of moral decisions, versus Scotus will place much more of an emphasis on the will and free choice in making decisions. Not to say that Thomas denies free will or Scotus denies the role of the intellect, but it's a question of where is the emphasis in our moral analysis. And there's quite a number of other things. There's a question as well, the analogy of being, about how we speak about God. It's sort of too hard to explain here if you don't have enough background. But if you go to my Substack, I actually just put out an article today on Scotus on the analogy of being. So he mentions Banyas here. So within Thomism, there's actually a number of different schools within Thomism. And there was an especial debate between sort of Dominican Thomism, sort of most represented by Banyas, and Jesuit Thomism, represented by Louis de Molina. And they had this big debate in the sort of late 16th, early 17th century about predestination. And you can sort of look up online and find out more stuff. To sort of simplify things, Banyas he's not a Calvinist, but to people who are not experts would probably sound like a Calvinist. There's this Molina emphasized much more of the role of middle knowledge, sort of actually been co-opted by quite a number of Protestants, this whole idea of middle knowledge. Scotists really weren't involved in this debate and had sort of their own opinion. That's difficult to explain, although some Scotists took up Molina's position. There was a number of other positions as well. So another important Jesuit named Suarez sort of created a middle ground position between the two. And yeah, Banya's idea is described what's called physical premotion. That not that we lack free will, but that God has to sort of give a first sort of push to us for us to be able to make that decision of free will. And this is called premotion. I do, as I've studied Aquinas more, I do see where the Banyesians are coming from the text of Thomas, but it still seems to me philosophically quite problematic. And yeah, the question is sort of, once the whole moral analysis is placed in terms of the intellect in Thomism, and once you move it over to the will in Scotus, you have to reframe all those questions again. And so this is where it becomes sort of own set of questions. But again, so the church on predestination, right, it sort of teaches these two important principles, that we have our freedom to make our own moral acts, but if we're saved, it's because of God's grace to save us. And there's certain extremes of, say, like double predestination, that God predestines people to hell that are condemned. And on the other end of Pelagianism, that we are able to save ourselves without God's grace, and that we're able to do any supernatural goods without God's grace. The church sort of takes a middle ground in this without defining the entirely correct answer to predestination. And so in this sort of, even the best saints, as we're seeing, disagreed on this question. Actually, the Pope invited the Molinists and the Banyesians to come debate this for like 10 years in Rome. And afterwards, basically, the Pope told both of them to shut up and stop publishing on this controversy. They were neither position as heretical, and in their controversy, were sort of creating a great scandal. This was at the same time as Protestantism was rising up. And see, all the debates in Protestantism that were being had about predestination were actually already had by Catholics in this, but less intelligent. And this has actually been shown by a Calvinist scholar named David Sitzma, who was shown at the Synod of Dort, sort of the famous Calvinist versus Arminian synod. They were actually copying all their arguments from the earlier debates between the Dominicans and the Jesuits about this. Once you read Catholic theology and seriously study it, and I don't mean like pop theology, but like actual Catholic theology, like honestly, all other theologies just seem like kind of unintelligent. I don't mean to be offensive to people in that, but they just kind of are.
Yeah, on the Calvinism stuff, I like bringing this up because I obviously decided to become a Catholic. Do you know Jeff Durbin?
Yeah.
He is one of my favorite Christians.
Mm-hmm.
The work that he does with like stuff like abortion is one of the first things that drew me into Christianity. Mm-hmm. And I think he is incredibly convincing when he talks about this stuff, even where I would disagree. So I just thought I'd give praise where praise is due to people that argue the case very well, even if I disagree. And even if at the end of the day, maybe somebody would present a better argument. But I do like to point that out with the Calvinists, especially with that particular group of people, because of the work that they do specifically was one of the things that drew me to Christianity. So I always like to shout them out and sing their praises a little bit.
Yeah, and the church recognizes that there are elements of truth and goodness, even in other religions, but that they only find their full perfection in the Catholic faith. That they're elements, but they're not properly situated. It's like you take one part, right? If you just ripped a bathroom out of a house, it might still be a nice bathroom and stuff, but like you wouldn't want to live in that. Like you want to live in the bathroom situated in the full house where you have the complete goodness there.
Yeah, let me close this one down and do a couple more super chats and then a few comments here that I have. Question for you again from James. Gideon, how much did Rambam influence Aquinas on natural theology in your opinion? I mean, I can also to that, but
I think he influenced him more on questions about like scriptural interpretation. He influenced him on natural theology almost more as like a negative of like, here's someone who got it wrong, because the Rambam, he almost, I need to actually read through the full guide for the perplexed and work through it and stuff. I've only read little portions and secondary sources and stuff. But as I understand it, he essentially denies we can really say anything proper about God. It's almost which is Aquinas, and this is the Catholic view, is that our language about God is analogous. So when I say God is good, he's not good in the way created things are good, but he is really good. And it's not merely a negation. Likewise, we say God is one. Right? As I understand it, Rambam, he says to say God is really one is almost like an act of idolatry. When we say God is not one, really we're just negating manyness. Versus there is some real sense, we would say, in which God is called one, but it's in an analogous sense. And from what I understand, the Guide for the Perplexed, like seeing the issues with this, actually did influence Aquinas in his articulation of natural theology, but I'm not that much of an expert in this.
So what's interesting is that, and we have to be careful with terminology, because obviously wisdom and rationality are not the same thing. But I find it very interesting that in his philosophical discourses, Maimonides really pushes the idea that one can come to knowledge of God through reason, and that is, and also to like you were saying with the Noahide laws versus like the natural theology stuff, but to a natural reason of what would be good in the world, and that we can use our reason to do that. And obviously knowing God through that would be the pinnacle of that. Really knowing the God of Israel obviously would be the pinnacle of that. But yet in the religious texts, more on focusing on the law, he says a Gentile who follows, who believes in God and follows the commandments of God for the nations, the Noahide laws, but doesn't do it because of revelation at Sinai, is not wise and not righteous.
And we would say this confuses the natural and the supernatural orders. So someone could, right, they would be having some natural virtue, but it would not necessarily be supernaturally meritorious because they're not doing it for this out of charity. Now, God does, because we live in a world in which God does desire all men to be saved. Right? This is as well as going back to Paul, that Paul says God desires all men to be saved and brought to the knowledge of the truth. And Aquinas talks about how actually all living humans are actually in some sense united with Jesus Christ. Because even those outside the church, and even those outside the church who will never be saved, are actually still united potentially, insofar as they could change their ways and be united with Christ. And so therefore God gives grace to all humans. He gives what we call sufficient grace to all humans to be saved. And so actually even Gentiles might actually be doing supernaturally meritorious acts, insofar as they're sort of doing them implicitly out of faith. I think you talked about this quite a bit when Jordash Thomist was on, and he's much more knowledgeable on this whole question of implicit faith than I am. So defer to him, because I'm probably about to say something wrong if I get too far into that.
So another interesting thing is just like that difference between the, I don't want to say consensus, because it's not necessarily a consensus view, but the general view that you find in Orthodox Judaism versus in Christianity as a whole. Mm-hmm. The idea of potentially in something. So in the Jewish world, as a Gentile, you could potentially become a Jew and be in the covenant of Israel, but there's no, you ought do it. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Christianity, you might have a potential to be in more of a relationship with Christ, and you ought do it. Mm-hmm. There's no different ought for different people, which is, I think, a very important point that I think, in my opinion, causes the whole philosophy of Judaism as we know it to collapse on a philosophical perspective. It contradicts arguments for the existence of God. Yeah, like the moral argument and the transcendental argument. By the way, when I brought up Jay Dyer before, I think it would actually be a fun conversation, because I think he's really good at explaining that the transcendental argument on that, as far as reasons for the existence of God. But
I'm just going to get a bit more water. I'll be back in a second.
Yeah. Let me do that. And I'll just wait for him there, because I think these are applicable to him mostly. Oh, that's fast.
There we go. Sorry, when I talk a lot, I tend to have to drink a lot of water.
Yeah, I don't even sit down for one of these without having a bottle of water with me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say it would be fun to have, people have been asking me to have more Orthodox Christians on, and I think I want to do that just to kind of give people kind of a well-rounded idea of what different ideas in Christianity are. And I personally, I struggled with making the decision to come to Catholicism, and people go like, oh, why? What was the question somebody asked? Oh, you just like this better or something like that about the Catholic Church, like you just prefer that. And I said, actually, I prefer the Eastern like philosophies and like that, and aesthetically I prefer the Eastern Orthodox Church, and all kinds of stuff that I prefer about the Eastern Orthodox Church. In spite of all that, I decided to be Catholic because I feel like it's where the truth lies, even though I prefer emotionally or aesthetically things in the Eastern Orthodox Church.
If you read all of like any Western theologian who's like worth their weight, they're quoting the Eastern Fathers constantly.
Right.
It's
a different attitude, though. It's just it's the same stuff. It's just a different attitude towards it.
No, I think so. I think there's definitely a very different culture and attitude and stuff and so on. But I think this shows in the Catholic Church, we can embrace every culture. So there can be truths that are discovered in, say, this Eastern context that might be better for one thing. And then those same truths can then be brought over and embraced by Westerners just as much. And likewise, Easterners can embrace Western truth. That there is one truth, but there's one truth that we might be approaching from different perspectives, and we can learn from one another on that. And this is where God, he creates a multitude of nations, right, as we unite different things, but he calls all those different nations into the single unity of the Catholic Church, so that way the whole world can be saved. And if we look in the biblical prophets again and again, God's plan has never been just to redeem Israel. It's been to redeem all the nations. And this is why the church has actually never forgotten its connection to the Jewish people. And this is something I think a lot of, say, the Groyper types get wrong, is they see the evangelicals perhaps overemphasize the Jews and like on certain places, but actually the church has always believed that the Jews are going to eventually convert and accept Christ and so on, and the Jewish nation itself will be saved, because God's plan is not just to redeem this or that nation, but to redeem all nations, and that God loves all mankind.
Yeah. Let me go back here. And then thank you for another super chat from James. I really appreciate it. How can Catholic Zionists like myself and Catholic Contra Zionists get along like brothers and not slag each other off? That's a tough one, right?
Yeah, there's a great quote I found on this recently from St. John Paul II. I'm going to try to pull it up here if I can.
I just want to quickly, before you get to that, because I personally don't like to use the word Zionist for myself, because I know the implication in some people's minds and I don't mean like Jew haters or anti-Israel. I mean in Jewish minds of the socialist 18th century, like Enlightenment ideology of Zionism.
Yeah.
So I don't like to use the term, but I defend Israel's right to exist and defend itself and have its own land and whatever. On a pragmatic and prudential, I don't think there's any theological justification to inherently side with Israel. But I defend Israel's right because I think Israel is the superior option of stability in the region and so on. And I think there's good cases to be made for that. If Israel was not doing things that were good and just, I would stop supporting them because I'm not a Zionist in that sense, like Christian Zionism. I don't believe in that.
Well, yeah, no, I would say as well, I don't use the label Zionist as well either, because I think it's even more and more nowadays referring to like the political Zionism of Rav Kook that I think is very theologically problematic as well, and even more insane stuff that I see floating around the internet as well. That makes Rav Kook.
But when we say Zion, but we are both, I guess, what some people refer to as Zionism in sense of just defending Israel's right to exist as a nation in their land.
Yes. Yeah. And I think this is where I want to get to this quote with St. John Paul II that I think is really great. And this is in a letter he put out called Redemptionis Anno, where he says it is not, and he's writing, this is on Good Friday. I think he wrote something specifically to the Christians living in Israel, where he says, it is natural in this context to recall that in the region, two peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, have been pitted against each other for decades in seemingly irreconcilable antagonism. And this is written in like 1980, I think. So it's been a lot longer than that now. The church, which looks to Christ the Redeemer and recognizes his image in the face of every man, calls for peace and reconciliation for the peoples of this land that was hers. For the Jewish people living in the state of Israel, who in that land preserve such precious testimonies of their history and faith, we must invoke the desired security and just tranquility that is the prerogative of every nation and a condition of life and progress for every society. The Palestinian people, whose historical roots are in that land and who have lived dispersed for decades, have the natural right and justice to rediscover a homeland and to live in peace and tranquility with the other people of the region. And he goes on here in a later paragraph to talk about the prophecy in Isaiah, where it talks about how many people will go up to Zion together, and talking about how this Jerusalem could actually become a great example for, right now it's sort of this horrible example for the world of people being able to live in peace, but could become this great example for the world of people coming to live in peace. And see, my examples, I have friends who are on both sides of this conflict. I have Catholic friends who live all throughout Israel. I mean, literally all throughout. I have friends in the Galilee. I have friends in Tel Aviv. I have friends in Beersheba. I have friends in Emmaus. I have friends in Jerusalem. So I've heard of what the situation is like all throughout Israel. I did an interview with some of my friends there on a podcast if people would like to listen to it. There's a lot of false information about what it's like to live there that floats around the internet. But as well, I think there's also another side as well. There's a guy interviewed on my channel, very kind and stuff. Hopefully consider me a friend, who unfortunately, he grew up in Gaza, and he's an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And unfortunately, his father and his sister died in this war. And I think that's something that these sorts of things need to be considered and treated seriously, that there are people who have very deep roots in this land who are Palestinians, a large majority of them do, that I think on the Zionist side can sometimes be downplayed. And I think ultimately, both Jews and Palestinians have very, very deep roots in this land, and they have to find some way to live together in peace. And I know there's people of different political opinions on how that ought to be achieved, and I'm not saying we ought to do this or that political solution, at least as any sort of public stance, but I think that that needs to be considered. And I think there's a real issue of the dehumanization, not only of like violence there, but actually the dehumanization of identities, right? That we live naturally in societies, and so we find our identity in those national societies. And so not only is it that we are harmed when people denigrate our sort of physical life, it's when they denigrate our national identities. That is actually an attack on who we are as persons, because it is where we find our relations with one another. And so I think when, say on the one side, right, Jews are sort of called white colonizers that don't actually have a place in Israel, besides the fact that besides the fact that most Jews in Israel are not actually Ashkenazi, setting that aside, what you're essentially saying there when you say Jews are white colonizers, don't have a place there, what you're really deep down saying is that Jews are not real Jews. And so that's actually you're not merely concerned at that point then about Palestinian rights, I think is a real concern. But what you're fundamentally saying, they're well-intentioned or not, is that Jews are not real Jews. And so you're attacking their identity of who they are as people. And likewise, it's the same thing on the other side, that I think many Zionists will talk about. Yes, Palestinian national identity is perhaps a more recent thing, but many of those families have close ties to particular cities and towns that they've been living in basically since time immemorial there, as far back as they can trace their own family histories. Probably many of them descending originally from Israelites or various people who settled down at different times. And so there are close tribes. There's been many times in history where local tribes have sort of come together and eventually form national communities under various political pressures. That's essentially what's happened. So it's a very organic development, I think, in many ways, of a Palestinian national identity as well. And so when Zionists say these are just Arab colonizers who have to be kicked out of the land, just like to a Jew, that's an attack on their identity as a Jew. It's an attack on their identity as a Palestinian. Even if it's a recent national identity, it's still a very deep-rooted cultural identity tied to particular places in the land. And so I think that in both sides here have to consider more deeply how the ways in which they think about this is deeply dehumanizing to the people who live there. And people will pick one side or the other and then decide to dehumanize the other side in ways that I find very concerning in a lot of these discussions. And now people can have political opinions about how we ought to resolve this, because I think there are very open discussions about, all right, should there be a one-state solution, a two-state solution, sort of many-state solution? I think the way in which we politically resolve this is a very open question, but I think it has to start from an affirmation that Christ tells us to love our enemies. And I think this is something that really has to be brought into this conflict, is that when you ask people to explain the history of the conflict to you, they pick a decade in which the other person did the sort of atrocity against their side first in that decade, and then they retell the history of, anything we did was only defense against that, sort of downplaying their own atrocities against the other side. And so I think we have to start with this idea of radical forgiveness and love of the enemy that can then flourish into a desire to live together as brothers in that land together, however that's going to work.
I do want to point out also that from personal experience, working when I was in the army in Israel and in security forces in East Jerusalem and things like that, I don't think there's a place in the world where Jews, Muslims, and Christians, for the most part, get along as well as in places like Jerusalem and in throughout Israel. There's a lot of communities of friends who are really good friends from the army and all kinds of stuff like that, who are Jews, Muslims, and Christians together, who get along great. And we need to see more of that. People just starting to more just human decency and respect. I remember long time ago, I remember seeing a video like maybe I don't think the reason what even was shorts then, of Marmari saying, you know, there's only, this is like a long time ago, some other incident that was happening, going, the only time that the Jews and the Israelis and the Palestinians will have peace is when they accept Jesus Christ. And I remember thinking it was such a stupid comment, because I'm like, there are Christians that kill each other conflicts throughout history. So that's not going to stop it. And even today you have, like you said, Christians on both sides of the political spectrum in Israel that differ wildly on their politics and don't necessarily get along, because there's still this political conflict even between Christians. But the reality is that it's a true statement, right? Like, it is through that acceptance of Christ that you could actually find that. Whereas I don't think there is another way to that. Like, realistically, I don't see a way to that happening without that.
There was a great sermon on this recently by Patriarch Pizzaballa, who is in an incredibly difficult position as the Bishop of Jerusalem there.
No kidding.
But he held a youth day that was for both the Arab youth and the Hebrew-speaking youth, which is a mix of sort of Jewish converts and let's say for various foreign workers, bringing together the youth of both sides for like a single youth day. And he gave this great sermon about how really there's sort of nothing that would unite this group of people here, and they live in different religious contexts and different political and religious contexts, except their common faith in Christ. And that's what's brought them together here. And they need to live out that faith in their own context. I'd also highly recommend everyone look up a film called Peacemakers, Crossing the Divide, which is about sort of Messianic Jews and other Jewish Christians, including one Jewish Catholic priest, coming together with Arab Christians and encountering one another and reaching across the aisle there. And it's really interesting. It was made by a woman named Lisa Loden, who's a Messianic Jew who made Aliyah to Israel, I think the 1970s. But then there was very few Messianic Jews in Israel at the time. Now there's a lot more. So she started getting in touch with the various Arab Christians there. And she started becoming good friends with Arab Christians in the West Bank and regularly going over to Bethlehem to worship, and discovering their own political situation was very different than what she was experiencing. And I think she's done very good work. I was at a recent talk she gave, and I asked in the Q&A about sort of how do we position ourselves to show love towards both sides without sort of taking a side clearly and stuff. And she said, no one can sort of put me in a box of which side I'm on, because I'm trying to seek love for all people and stuff. And I think that's the sort of approach that we ought to take towards this, even if I'm living here in America, so I don't really have much of an influence on what goes on there. But I have lots of friends who live there. And so I think it's important for them in their own context to be thinking about how these things work out.
Let's go to a couple of comments here. We got somebody who got tickets already.
Oh, thank you.
Awesome. And my wife says, wow, Gideon is going like rapid fire on all the teachings. Very impressive.
Thank you.
And we got here...
Yeah. If I'm speaking too quickly, I'm intentionally trying to slow myself down. This is the slowest I can go.
I wouldn't know, because I talk way too fast a lot of the time. So somebody else is going to have to, somebody's going to have to do that. You had a discussion with somebody that I should have a discussion with, apparently.
Yeah, Jacob Fatarecki. He's a Jewish YouTuber.
Is he, like, what's his deal, I guess?
Yeah, he was like Chabad for a long time. I think he's ethnically Mizrahi, but he's Chabad for a long time, and then sort of fell away from Judaism, and he's not observant anymore, but he goes on YouTube and sort of pontificates about Judaism. He still believes like all of Orthodox Judaism. He just doesn't really practice.
He believes it's true and doesn't do it.
Okay. Yeah.
Interesting.
He's a nice guy though. We get along, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to always understand that when you're arguing ideologies and stuff with people, that it's still a person there and all that. And then somebody asks here, Pope Saint Agatha literally said, because somebody was talking and they were having a argument in the chat about the papacy, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you know who this is?
No, I don't know who that is.
Pope Saint Agatha.
Oh, Pope St. Agatha. Yes, he was a pope before the schism. Yes, he wrote a letter basically saying the pope can never err, and this was accepted by all the Eastern bishops.
Okay, interesting.
You need to get either Eric Ibarra or Elijah Yassi on your channel to talk about the papacy, because it's actually, you would expect, given the Orthodox Catholicism, it would be very unclear who's correct. But when you actually go through the evidence, it's just very clear that the papacy existed in the first millennium as the Catholic Church understands it.
Interesting. And then we got here, would either of you or both of you consider yourself trad cats?
I would say in the sense that I believe the tradition that's handed down, but not in the sense that I'm saying that to the exclusion of the living magisterium. And very often trads end up believing lots of things that were actually just novel ideas they came up with that are not traditional. And so I think it's important to interpret the tradition in a way that's handed down in continuity with the living magisterium, as well as to interpret the living magisterium in continuity with the tradition.
I am too new to Catholicism to have a YouTube denomination yet.
Yeah.
A social media Catholic sub-denomination yet.
Yeah. I'll say there's a great spot of Paul where he talks about people are making identities of, and he's asking are you baptized in the name of Barnabas and stuff? No, you're baptized in the name of Jesus, so that's your identity. And so we're baptized in the name of charismatic or trad or so on. We're baptized as Catholics in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That our unity is in God.
You got somebody arguing with you in the chat. Okay.
Yeah.
You seem like you know what you're talking about.
Yeah. All
right. Was there anything that you wanted to go into further if we have more time for the social teaching?
No, that's everything. I guess there's another section I didn't really touch on just war, but yeah, you have to fight wars that are just if you're going to fight wars. But there is a place in Catholic teaching for the role of self-defensive wars and so on that are just. There are certain principles the church teaches basically to determine whether or not a war is just.
Look who came in the chat. Look at that. Great to
Evan
have
is
you.
Great.
Yeah. Yes, he is. Okay. Is there anyone in the chat that has any specific question that you guys want to cover?
Yes, someone asked about Alan Fimister's book called Romanitas, and yes, that's a great book people should read.
Where's that?
I saw it near the top of the chat there.
It might be. Am I too far back here?
I don't know. Yeah, but anyways, the book is called The Iron Scepter of the Son of Man. Romanitas is a Note of the Church by Alan Fimister. It's a great book.
Okay. Oh, there we go. What do you think of Dr. Alan Fimister's treatise on... Oh, so what is this?
Yeah, so this is essentially the question of not just the Pope being in Rome, but the idea of Romanness. So the idea here is that in the book of Daniel, we see these four kingdoms, right, of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And then we see the fifth kingdom, the Messiah's kingdom, come in, and the saints inherit the fourth kingdom. That sort of each kingdom is conquering the last. And so actually, in some sense, the church inherits the Roman Empire. And then actually... And we see this even, that our canon law, for example, the church is based on Roman law and its principles of how you do law, that all the goods of Roman civilization are inherited by the church. And so when the Jews, for example, think of Rome as being identified with the Catholic Church, they're actually kind of correct on that identification. And this actually goes all the way back to the Torah, right? That we see God is initially, or Noah, and he's blessing Shem and Japheth. He says that God will enlarge Japheth, as the Europeans, but they will dwell in the tents of Shem, that they'll accept the religion of Shem. And so God enlarges Japheth in sort of these great empires, culminating with the Japhethite empires of the Romans, that's then inherited and by the tents of Shem, that it dwells in the tents of Shem. And interestingly, St. Paul, who goes and evangelizes the Greeks and the Romans and the Gentiles, do you know what his profession was, his day job?
Whose day job?
St. Paul.
St. Paul? Wasn't he a... Oh, you're saying while he was doing that, or while he was a Pharisee, like rabbi?
Well, he had a day job to pay his bills, though, which was that he was a tent maker.
I didn't know that.
And so actually this prophecy of to dwell in the tents of Shem is fulfilled by a tent maker when he goes and he brings the gospel to the Romans.
Oh,
and as well, interesting, it's something I've noticed that I've been trying to work out a bit, is that when we look at, the Japhethite nations that are listed in the Table of Nations, they're actually never mentioned again in the Torah after their listing, except for a single mention, which is Kittim, which Kittim comes up again in Numbers 24. And this is a prophecy that the Jews agree as well as a prophecy of the Messiah. In Numbers 24, you can find this prophecy mentioned by Rambam in the Mishneh Torah when he's discussing the requirements for the Messiah, as well as in the Ramban when he comments on this in his commentary on the book of Numbers. And this kingdom of Kittim, it's taken up again in the book of Daniel in Daniel 11:30 to be about the Roman Empire. And this is sort of a list of things that have to happen for the coming of the Messiah. That there has to be a defeat of the Amalekites. This happens in the time of Saul, and then we get King David. Then there has to be the taking away of the kingdoms into exile. And this happens through the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles. And then the kingdom of Kittim has to come, which is the Romans. And so actually in the Torah, the rise of the Romans is actually sort of a sign that the Messiah is about to come. And so this is actually a sign we can see. And actually the Romans understood this themselves, that if you read the Roman writings, they had this whole idea that they were going to be this sort of everlasting empire, that they were the culmination of all of human history leading up to them. And actually Virgil is this great poet. He writes this poem about how this child is about to be born that's going to bring about a golden age through all of history. And then shortly after he writes that, Jesus is born. And so he expected it to happen through this political marriage of like Augustus and I think some woman from another line that was going to unite Rome, which didn't end up working out. But the real piece we find in the child who is born is Christ who is born. And so actually in many ways, this whole Roman mythologization of themselves is actually fulfilled in Jesus, who converts the Roman Empire. And so the Messiah defeats Rome by incorporating Roman civilization into itself. And actually, in 2 Thessalonians, St. Paul discusses this idea of the catechon, who is restraining the Antichrist from coming. And the church fathers talk about how this is Roman civilization, which is holding back the force of it. So as we're seeing, a good friend of mine, Joshua Charles, suggests that as we're seeing sort of the breakdown both of Western civilization and of the church's role in society, this is where we're seeing these sort of antichristic forces arising in society. I'm not saying the Antichrist necessarily is around the corner, but the spirit of the Antichrist is sort of taking over our society as the catechon is being removed from our society.
This is really, I don't know what's going on here, but I don't know if it's the same person, but I've gotten this comment before, like on videos. They think I'm AI.
Yeah.
And then my wife is like, trust me, he's not AI.
You have to say that as an AI language learning model, you wouldn't say this if you were AI. And I was at this theology conference, and a professor was telling me about a paper he got from a student. It was like an undergrad intro to theology course, and they had to write on abortion. And a student has in like the middle of their paper, as an AI language learning model, I do not have an opinion on the morality of abortion. And they handed it in that way.
That's great. AI is really powerful, but you can't trust it for anything. Like you can't use AI to like craft an argument or a paper, because it's not one, even if it did work, it would corrupt your own ability to think for yourself if you were depending on it. But also it's just not correct. It makes egregious errors all the time. And I just love when people try to respond to a comment that I make, and they respond. You can very clearly see that it's an AI generated comment. And it's like, is it not embarrassing for you that you don't think for yourself? Like, it's fine to use AI if you already know what you're talking about and you're just like, where can I research this, or how can I structure this? Like, it's fine to use AI for that, but don't have AI craft your thoughts for you.
Oh, absolutely. There are good uses. Some people I think are too harsh. Like, it's really helpful if you're in a long meeting to like take the transcript of the meeting, throw it into AI, and be like, can you write up like notes for me of what we discussed this meeting? It does great stuff like that. Like as a tool for like an assistant,
basically.
Yeah, another great an AI tool I use a lot is called Notebook LM, where you can throw books into it and it will basically search for content of the books, but then it will give you citations. So you can click on the citations and actually read the sections. So it's helpful if books don't have like a good index or stuff like that to try to find pages. But no, as a whole, like yeah, people are relying too much on AI. I hate the whole like at Grok or people tagging stuff on Twitter to describe stuff.
I'm not on any other social media except YouTube, and thank God for that. Whatever little bit of my sanity is left. We got a couple more super chats. Daniel Ward, thank you. Gideon, I enjoyed your debate on Daniel 9. It was very edifying. Would you ever consider having another debate?
I would like to do more debates in the future, but it takes me a lot of time to prep for the debate because you really got to think of everything the other person might say, know everything inside and out, so you don't look dumb when like the actual debate happens. So no, I would like to do that. I just haven't had any time to do debates.
So people have asked me about debating, and when I first started doing this, and people are like, "Do you want to debate?" I'm like, "Sure," because I wasn't thinking it through. I'm happy to debate when I have the time, which is not now. However, I think it's important to remember that a lot of the culture around this debate online stuff now is just, "Hey, can you win points for my side, please?" Anyone can go into a debate and focus entirely on rhetoric with no substance and score points for their team. But do you want to represent your side well and not misrepresent the other side because you're not educated enough to deal with the steel man of their conversation? So I'm still hesitant for that because nor do I want to misrepresent my own side by not being prepared for it, and nor do I want to misrepresent my opponents, because I know that will just devolve into baseless rhetoric that just sounds nice for people that already agree with me, and it's not going to convince anyone of anything. Not that that's what Daniel was asking about, but I thought I would just throw that in there because it's been brought up.
Yeah, I don't think I'm particularly the most skilled debater. Like, I think I'm much better when I just have a lot of time to think out and explain my own views, and people can read me, they can read other people. And I think sometimes debating is sort of overstated, that you do a lot better from actually just reading books on both sides of an argument.
I think that's what I think a lot of people don't want to educate themselves on certain topics. And again, I wasn't referencing the comment here. I know Daniel is pretty knowledgeable. There's a lot of people that don't want to take the time to educate themselves. So they just want to hear the debate and then set their opinion on that, instead of looking to the debate and going, "Oh, what was brought up and where can I go to those sources and where can I learn more about this topic?" It's people that are, not necessarily interested, but again, want the like if I went into a debate right now with somebody on any topic, even one that I'm well versed on, just because I haven't done debates, a lot of it would, if it's not a conversation like a back and forth, if it's a formal debate, probably focus too much on rhetoric and not necessarily have the time to craft my arguments properly. Yeah. So that's something that I definitely want to improve on.
There also, I think, sometimes in these can be a prioritization of winning a debate over truth. Right. And so there are Catholic apologists who will say like things that just aren't actually correct according to church teaching, or at least problematic, that people will give a pass to simply because they're good at winning debates. And I think that this is a huge problem that has to be addressed. And so that's why I don't. There's some people I've spoken to about this, and they'll be like, well, they're really good at debating, and if you call them out on this issue, that will give the Muslims ammunition, or this will give whoever ammunition. And it's just they can't actually think about whether or not something is true or false, or whether or not something is good conduct or not. They're so focused on winning a debate.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. Debate sometimes a rhetorical blood sport. Yeah, if I go into a debate like that, if I'm good at rhetoric, it would become a blood sport, and I know that about myself, and I don't want to go there, unless it's Tuvia Singer, in which case I'll do it. But let's go here. We've got Radar. Awesome to see you there. Thank you for joining. Thank you. And from Suzanne, just saying hi, I'm only on YouTube as well. Thanks for this great discussion. From a confirmed prot to my Catholic brother. Thank you. And James Scott, thank you so much. How much Jewish tradition practice can Catholics do, in your opinion, Gideon?
Yeah, this is something I'm still trying to work out and understand because, if you look in like the earliest days of the church in the book of Acts, the early Catholics were still keeping a lot of Jewish traditions. They were essentially Catholicism was really still a sect of Judaism at the time. But then we see a few centuries later, this is sort of God, this is the church had mostly become Gentile. And so the way the church fathers understood this is sort of there was this period of transition in which the church was still primarily sort of within Judaism. So that way the church sort of had time to come about for this time of transition. And so because of this, to not lead to confusion, a sort of confusion between religions, the church sort of saw it as best to actually forbid many Jewish customs, because there was not because those customs in themselves were bad, but sort of because there was a concern that this would lead to religious confusion, that if keeping them, it would seem as though people were sort of living in the old covenant rather than now living in the fullness that Christ has brought to us. But this sort of raises issues because there are many Catholic traditions that come from like the Old Testament. So, for example, in the East, in Eastern Christians, there's a tradition of women staying home for the first 40 days after birth and then having a ritual purification. Versus in the West, this looked to Westerners like a sort of Judaizing. And likewise, on the other side, certain Western practices like treating Saturday as a holy day look to Eastern Christians like a form of Judaizing. And this was brought up especially as many Eastern Christians were coming back to the church. Now that they couldn't just throw polemics at each other after the schism when they were broken up, they had to actually resolve this. And so Pope Benedict XIV in the 1700s wrote a letter called Ex Quo, where he sort of resolves this. And he says, if these practices are being practiced in the context of the rites of the church, they actually they can't be called Judaizing, because what you're doing at that point is Catholic practices, not necessarily Jewish practices. Now, this creates an interesting pastoral question to Jews who come into the Catholic Church of how should we pastorally treat them? So the pastoral practice throughout much of church history was that it was sort of safest to assimilate them into the Gentile populations that they were part of, because like you just have one individual like Catholic hanging out in medieval France who's a convert from Judaism. It's easiest to sort of treat him as a Frenchman at that point. But now there's large numbers of people coming in, and the church has always had an idea that eventually the Jews would come into the Catholic faith. And so now that there's many Jews coming in, and the church has an idea that all that is good and holy in cultures ought to be perfected in the Catholic faith. And we don't have an issue necessarily with Jewish practices practiced in the context of the Catholic faith per se. Could there be sort of a Hebrew rite or something like that where these Jewish practices are taken up within the Catholic faith? And such a thing has actually been given, to a certain degree, liturgical permission by Cardinal Burke when he was the Archbishop of St. Louis, as well as recently by Patriarch Pizzaballa. So this is two of the most conservative cardinals in the Catholic Church today alive, Burke and Pizzaballa, are giving permission to this. So it's very clearly not like some sort of liberal thing, which we're sometimes accused of. The group you can look up is called
You Judaizer, you.
I know. I get accusations from what I call the online Inquisition, where they sort of self-appoint themselves. And now they're actually coming after Cardinal Burke a little bit because he's defending Pope Leo. And they're going to come after Pizzaballa when they discover he's not a groyper, which they've sort of written him in their mind as that. But they've given permission, and so I see this clearly. It's not some sort of liberal reason that it's being given permission, but that this is actually not even merely pastoral, but it's really about the redemption of everyone's culture, right? That we find our identity in the society in which we live in. And part of that is our traditions of our ancestors that we ought to uphold. And so to rip someone away from those ancestral traditions, it can sometimes be necessary, but it ought to be minimized because of how harmful that is to a person's life, right? That those traditions bind them there to their ancestors. It's like I treat some stuff like Hanukkah, for example. I lit a menorah and I treated this as a feast and celebration of the Maccabean saints, because we have the Book of Maccabees is actually in the Catholic Bible, and so I see this, right? I'm honoring the saints of the Maccabees. Or, for example, on Yom Kippur, I offer fasting is a good thing to do, and I went and I fasted. And I went to adoration to go offer up prayers for the conversion of the Jewish people, as well as to pray for contrition for my own sins. And I don't see these things as contrary to the Catholic faith. Like, I think it's a lot better that the fact Yom Kippur came up on the calendar inspired me to go spend the day at adoration, rather than to simply ignore it because someone online might get mad at me about it. And so this is sort of where I see things. I think the exact boundaries of what can and can't be done, what should and shouldn't be done, are very unclear. And I think further guidance is needed from the Catholic magisterium about this. That I think that and actually there are discussions. So I'm going to give you some interesting lore on this now. You can go into. So there's actually been a sort of private Catholic Messianic Jewish dialogue with the Vatican since the time of St. John Paul II. Now, this has sort of been in private because it would offend mainstream Jews. That sort of they don't want to see that word. Right? The sort of mainstream Jews really don't like Messianic Jews. But you can actually find the history of quite a bit of this dialogue in Mark Kinzer's book, Searching Her Own Mystery. So he's a Messianic Jew who actually wrote a book on a Messianic Jewish perspective on Vatican II, based on the talks he had been doing at this Messianic Jewish Catholic dialogue. And he gives the history of the dialogue up to around 2010 or so, I think, in that book when it came out. And actually, the book has the endorsement on the cover of Cardinal Schönborn, who's another very conservative cardinal in the church, and the Bishop of Vienna. And this has actually continued. And actually, Pope Benedict was connected with them as well. Pope Benedict actually told the Messianic Jews that if you are who you say you are, Christ is coming back soon. That actually was one of the signs, even in traditional Catholic teaching, and it's in the Catechism as well, that the conversion of the Jews is one of the signs of the return of Christ. This isn't just some idea dispensationalists made up. And then as well, actually, Pope Francis was connected with them as well. So this actually just recently came out. I saw an interview with this Messianic Jewish rabbi who mentioned he was going around South America with... who is it? This Catholic priest who was also involved in the dialogue. And they went around South America and they actually met with Cardinal Bergoglio, who everyone should know became Pope Francis. And so they're going to meet with him. And that morning, the news comes out that Pope Benedict has resigned. And so the cardinal needs to fly back real soon to go to the conclave where he's then going to be elected Pope. And he comes down and he meets with the... Cardinal Bergoglio and speaks with him for a long time. And he's actually very, very positive towards the Messianic Jews. And in the end, they end up praying together that a pope who would be good to the Jews will be elected. And then Pope Francis was elected. And I actually know that he was involved in a dialogue. I don't know how much I can say. If Pope Francis had lived a few more months, there would have been official documents that were coming about the Hebrew Catholics. That's all I will say. I will know that. I don't know how much more. I probably shouldn't have even said that. But I know a little. I only know a tiny bit of the inside baseball, but there was a tiny bit that I know that was going on there. Unfortunately, from what I've heard, Pope Leo was not involved in those discussions before this, so hopefully he will continue those discussions.
And yeah, Radar said something here about, I just got rid of it by accident. So he was saying that was interesting, and he's heard there are Hebrew Catholics I'm aware of with brachot formulas for prayers. Do you know about that?
I know various people have put together things, but there's nothing.
By the way, with Radar, it's like Hebrew Catholics.
Yeah. So, what was it? No, a friend of mine.
Radar loves the whole Jewish people. Radar's great.
Yeah. Was it? You know, a friend of mine is discussing putting together a Hebrew Catholic Siddur that I think would be very good, because sort of everyone comes up with their own thing right now, and we have a million different ideas just sort of floating around. So I think it would be good for someone to put out something more official and standardized. As well, this friend of mine, he's actually working as well, not only with Pizza Olives, he lives in Israel, but he's also working with the Syriac Catholic Bishop of Jerusalem as well, who's very, very supportive of them. And so I think this could take it out of the Latin rite a little bit and put it much more in its proper context to be truly Middle Eastern rite, of something like the Syriac rite.
All right, I think I'm trying to scroll through to see if we got anything here. As far as questions.
Someone mentioned Pius the Tenth's discussion with Theodore Herzl, which everyone takes out of context, but it actually talks about having Jewish friends in that discussion. If you actually read the whole discussion, like, it doesn't at all say what the Groypers think he says in it.
I don't know if this person is implying that bringing Jews to faith in Christ is a bad thing.
No, I think that the church, it really wants to take up all nations and redeem all nations. This is going to take up what's good about the nations, and it's a very good thing. But it also tells us that we have to respect every other nation. And so the nations that our nation sort of has long-term ethnic hatreds with, we tend to get really offended. So when I tell Israelis, no, you have to really care about the Palestinian people, they'll get very offended. When I speak likewise, and not just as individual Arabs, but as a people and their dignity as a people. And likewise, on the other end, when you tell anti-Semites that, no, you have to desire the good of the Jewish people and want the redemption and the goods of the Jewish people, not merely as individuals, but as a people, they'll get very offended at that. And so I think the church brings out all of what's best in us and seeks to quell all of what's worst in us.
And I think it's important to remember for all the people in the chat that are arguing back and forth, you're all professing various stances on Christian belief. At the very least, you should all remember to pray for each other.
Mm-hmm.
So please do that, and I will be praying for all of you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the Syriacs have their own thing.
Yeah, this is the West Syriac, right? This is like a different group, but it would look somewhat like the Maronites and stuff.
Because the Maronites are the only ones that were always in communion with Rome, right? Of the Eastern churches.
I've heard different opinions on the history of whether that's retconned or not, but officially they were.
I was told that the Maronites were on like a mountain. They had like their little place.
Yeah.
And that they didn't know that there was a schism because they were surrounded by like hostile people.
Yeah. They were sort of doing their own things, didn't get along with any of the other Eastern Christians around. And when the Crusaders showed up, they're like, I guess we're with you then. So depending on how you read the history, they either were in communion or not, which if you actually look at the real history, who was in communion with who before the modern internet was actually a much more complicated question, because with modern communication, we can immediately contact everyone in the world. And so who's in communion with who everywhere on earth has to be resolved immediately. In the pre-modern world, that's much more of a difficult question. Even in some countries, it still is. Like exactly what church certain countries in the Middle East people are part of. They'll know, oh, I'm Byzantine, but they'll be attending a Melkite church and an Orthodox church, and to them, it's not very clear necessarily which church they're in because they're in the church where the Muslims aren't currently killing them at, you know? So I think sometimes from when we're in the West and everything's nice and stuff, the lines can be a lot easier to see. And I think that's ultimately, unfortunately, what it's going to take for us to reunite is intense persecutions that make us realize we have more important things.
Yeah. If everyone is, if we're pretty good on questions there, if everyone is done with all their questions, I think we're going to close out now. A couple things here. First of all, don't forget to go to the video description and check out the conference. If you want to just one more time, for anyone who just tuned in, Gideon, for your conference. I think I keep saying your conference. You're the organizer.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, we're organizing a conference called Christ the King, Catholic Social Teaching and the Theology of Creation. It will be on November 22nd. We're going to have a lot of great talks from I think what are some of the leading Catholic scholars alive today on various topics in the theology of creation and Catholic social teaching. So yeah, I highly recommend everyone go register for that. You can use the code ASH for 50% off. And then as well, you can, if you're a clergy or religious, reach out to me and I'll be able to give you a discount code that will get you in for free.
And then just everyone watching, again, I do remind you, because I still see, I know that there was a lot of back and forth in the chat. Remember to pray for each other and to pray for everyone, really. Either your own personal thing. There are formulated prayers you can use if you want to do it that way, depending on if you're used to praying for your people you don't like or not. Maybe start with something formulated that somebody else wrote. But and then the other thing, if anyone knows anyone that wants to come on for a discussion, I've had 2 Catholics on in a row. I'm happy to have another Catholic on. I'm becoming Catholic, and no problem with that. But if you know anyone from a Protestant background that wants to come and discuss things, if somebody from a Eastern Orthodox, anything, to kind of just give people kind of an idea of what everything is and what all the different opinions are, I'm happy to have people on. So if you have any suggestions, reach out to those people. Give them my email. It's in my channel description. And yeah, have a wonderful evening or morning or wherever you are for everyone watching. And I'll just put the outro and then I'll close it down.